The ground shook before the screaming started. Lyra pressed her back against the broken wall of the healing tent, her hands full of torn cloth, as the last wave of soldiers stumbled through the smoke. Blood painted the grass in dark patches. Somewhere behind her, a man was crying out for water, and somewhere ahead, something enormous was dragging itself across the battlefield, leaving a trail wide enough to swallow a cart. She had heard the stories since she was a child. The Alpha King commanded a creature that no ordinary soldier could look at without shaking. They called it the Beast of Veremore, though it had another name that only the king used, a name whispered like a secret. Tonight, for the first time, Lyra was going to see it with her own eyes, and she did not know yet that her life was about to change forever. The camp had been set up in a hurry after the battle ended near the river Solvith. Tents rose in crooked rows, torches burned low, and everywhere there was the smell of smoke and iron. Lyra had been assigned to the healing tents 3 months ago, taken in by an old woman named Agnes who had lost her own daughter to a fever years before, and never quite stopped looking for someone to save. Agnes taught her how to clean a wound, how to stop bleeding, how to tell when a soldier's fever meant infection instead of exhaustion. Lyra had learned quickly, not because she wanted glory, but because she could not stand to watch someone suffer without trying to help. Tonight, however, nothing she had learned prepared her for what came stumbling out of the dark. The first sign was the sound, a deep, rattling breath, like wind moving through a cave, followed by a low growl that made the ground hum beneath her boots. Soldiers scattered, even the wounded, men who could barely stand, dragged themselves away from the sound as fast as their bodies allowed. Lyra stood frozen for a moment, gripping the cloth in her hands, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she saw it. The creature was larger than any animal she had ever imagined, its body covered in dark fur streaked with dried blood, its shoulders as wide as a small wagon. Its eyes glowed faintly, a strange amber color that seemed to hold something almost human behind the wildness. It moved slowly, favoring one side, and with every step, a low sound of pain escaped its throat. This was Ashka, the Alpha King's beast, the one soldiers said had torn through entire enemy lines without slowing down, the one that had never let another living soul touch it besides the king himself. Now it collapsed near the edge of the healing tents, its massive body sending up a cloud of dust as it hit the ground. The healers who had been rushing between wounded soldiers froze in place. No one moved. No one dared. "Get back," someone shouted. "It will kill anyone who gets close." Lyra should have listened. She had every reason to listen. She was not a warrior, not a guard, not someone whose duty required her to risk her life for a creature that terrified grown soldiers. But something in the way the beast breathed, ragged and shallow, reminded her too much of the men she had spent the last few hours trying to save. Pain did not care whether it lived inside a soldier or a monster. Pain was pain, and Lyra had spent her whole life unable to walk away from it. She set down the cloth she was holding, picked up a bowl of clean water instead, and began walking toward the fallen beast. "Lyra, no." Agnes's voice cracked behind her, sharp with fear. "That thing will take your arm off before you take 3 more steps." "It's hurt," Lyra said, not stopping. "Just look at it. It's hurt worse than half the men we've treated tonight. It's not a man. It's a monster bred for war. Come back here right now." But Lyra kept walking, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the distant sounds of the camp settling into uneasy quiet. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though her body understood the danger even while her mind refused to turn back. The beast's amber eyes opened halfway when she came close enough for it to notice her, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to disappear. The shouting, the smoke, the distant cries of wounded men, all of it faded until there was only the sound of her own breath and the deep, ragged breathing of the creature in front of her. It did not attack. It watched. Lyra lowered herself slowly to her knees, keeping her movements as calm and steady as she could manage, despite the trembling in her hands. She had treated frightened animals before, farm dogs caught in traps, a wounded hawk once that had nearly taken off her finger, and she knew that sudden movement was often what triggered an attack, rather than the presence of a stranger itself. She kept her voice low and even. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly, though she had no idea if the creature could understand her words, or if it understood anything at all beyond instinct and pain. "I only want to help." Just let me look." The beast's ears, torn in places from old scars, twitched at the sound of her voice. Its lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth longer than her forearm, and a low growl rumbled through its chest. Lyra's whole body went rigid, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she did not move. She simply waited, the bowl of water balanced carefully in her hands, until the growl faded into something quieter, almost like a sigh. Behind her, she could hear more soldiers gathering, their voices hushed with disbelief. Word was already spreading through the camp, faster than fire through dry grass. The healer's girl was kneeling beside the Alpha King's beast, and it had not torn her apart. Lyra reached out with the wet cloth, moving with painstaking slowness, and touched it gently to a deep gash along the beast's shoulder. The creature flinched, a shudder running through its entire massive frame, but it did not lunge, did not snap, did not do any of the things everyone around her expected. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as though giving her permission to continue, and let out a long breath that stirred the dust beneath its jaw. "Good," Lyra whispered, more to herself than to the beast. "That's good, just stay still for me." She worked carefully, cleaning the wound with steady hands despite the fear still coursing through her veins. The gash was deep, likely from a spear or a blade during the chaos of battle, and she could see bits of dirt and torn fabric embedded in the wound that needed to come out before infection set in. She had no proper medicine for a creature this size, only the same herbs and cloths she used for the soldiers. But she worked with the same care and attention she would give to any patient, because to her, in that moment, that was exactly what this creature was. Time seemed to stretch strangely as she worked. She lost track of how long she knelt there, cleaning one wound after another, murmuring soft reassurances that she was not even sure the beast could understand. All she knew was that with every pass of the cloth, the growling grew quieter, the trembling in its muscles eased, and by the time she finished bandaging the last wound along its side, the creature's breathing had slowed into something closer to rest. It was only then that she noticed the silence around her. The camp had gone completely still. Soldiers stood frozen at a distance, their faces pale in the torchlight. Agnes stood near the healing tent, with both hands pressed over her mouth, and beyond them, standing at the edge of the crowd with an expression Lyra could not read, stood a man she had never met, but somehow knew immediately. He wore armor scorched black in places from battle, a long cloak torn at the hem, and a crown so simple it barely looked like one at all, just a thin band of dark metal resting against damp hair. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved from the beast to Lyra and back again, as though trying to make sense of something that defied everything he understood about the world. This was Cale, the Alpha King of Veremore. Lyra had heard his name spoken with fear and respect in equal measure, had heard soldiers describe him as a man who never lost a battle, and never showed mercy to those who threatened his kingdom. She had not expected him to look so exhausted, so human, standing there in the torchlight with blood on his hands, and grief carved into the lines of his face. She rose slowly to her feet, suddenly aware of how strange the scene must look. A healer's assistant, covered in dirt and dried blood, kneeling beside the most feared creature in the kingdom, as though it were nothing more than an injured farm animal. "You touched him," Cale said, his voice low and rough, from shouting orders during the long battle. It was not a question, it was disbelief given shape. "He was hurt," Lyra answered simply, gesturing toward the bandaged wounds along the beast's side. "I did what I would do for anyone who needed help. He has never let anyone near him, not soldiers, not healers, not even members of my own court who tried to approach him during his recovery years ago." Cale took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her, searching for some trick, some explanation that made sense within the world he understood. "Ashka does not trust easily. He has been trained since birth to answer to no one but me." Lyra glanced down at the great creature resting quietly beside her, its amber eyes now half closed, its breathing steady and calm. She found it strange, standing there being questioned as though she had done something impossible, when all she had done was offer comfort to something in pain. "Maybe he was just tired of hurting," she said quietly. "Maybe he needed someone to see that, instead of being afraid of him." Something shifted in Cale's expression, though Lyra could not tell exactly what it meant. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle missing its final piece, curious and cautious all at once. Around them, the soldiers began to whisper again, their voices carrying words like witch and charm and unnatural, words that made Agnes step forward protectively, though she said nothing out loud. Cale raised a hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly. "What is your name?" he asked, addressing Lyra directly for the first time. "Lyra," she answered. "I work with the healers." Lyra, he repeated the name slowly, as though testing its weight. "You will continue to care for him until his wounds heal. That is an order." A ripple of surprise moved through the gathered crowd, but no one dared question the king's command aloud. Lyra felt her stomach tighten, with a strange mixture of fear and something else she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. She had come to the war camp expecting to spend her days treating soldiers and returning home when the fighting ended, not becoming personally responsible for the most feared creature in the kingdom. "Yes, my lord," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Cale studied her for one more long moment, his gaze flickering briefly toward Ashka, who had not moved from Lyra's side despite the king's presence only a few steps away. Something about that fact seemed to trouble him more than anything else that had happened that night, though he did not say so aloud. Instead, he turned and walked away without another word, his cloak dragging through the dirt and ash, leaving behind a silence thick with unanswered questions. Agnes rushed forward the moment he was gone, gripping Lyra's shoulders with trembling hands. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Do you understand what could have happened to you?" "I know," Lyra said softly, though her eyes remained fixed on the great creature resting beside her, its breathing slow and steady now, its amber eyes watching her with something that looked almost like gratitude. "But look at him, Agnes. He's calm. He let me help him." Agnes followed her gaze, her expression torn between fear and reluctant amazement. "That beast has never let a soul near him except the king. Everyone knows it. Soldiers have died trying to feed him when the king was away. And you walked right up to him, like he was nothing more than an injured puppy." "Maybe that's exactly what he needed someone to see," Lyra murmured. She did not yet understand what she had started that night, kneeling in the dirt beside a creature everyone feared, cleaning wounds no one else dared touch. She did not know that across the camp, whispers of her name were already spreading like wildfire, reaching ears that would soon decide her fate, for better or worse. She did not know that the king, walking away into the darkness with his crown sitting crooked on his head, could not stop thinking about the strange calm that had settled over his beast the moment she touched him. All Lyra knew, as she settled down beside the sleeping creature to keep watch through the rest of the night, was that something had shifted in the world around her. Something she could not yet name, but could feel deep in her bones, the way one feels the first chill of winter, long before the snow ever falls. Above her, the stars burned cold and distant over the ruined battlefield, and beside her, the Alpha King's beast slept peacefully, for the first time in longer than anyone in the camp could remember. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the crackle of dying torches and the distant murmur of soldiers who could not sleep after such a brutal day. Lyra sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, her back against a broken cartwheel, close enough to Ashka that she could feel the warmth rising from his massive body. Every so often his ear would twitch, or his tail would shift against the dirt, small signs that told her he was still aware of her presence even in his exhausted state. She thought about her life before the war camp, back when she was a small girl, living in a village near the eastern hills, before sickness took her parents and left her with nothing but a name and a determination to survive. Agnes had found her wandering the roads 3 years later, thin and silent, carrying nothing but a broken knife and a stubborn refusal to beg for scraps. The old healer had taken her in without asking many questions, teaching her the trade of healing, not because Lyra asked to learn it, but because Agnes recognized something familiar in her, a girl who had already learned that the world could take everything from you in a single night and leave you standing anyway. Lyra had grown up fast after that, faster than most children her age. She learned to set bones before she learned to read properly, learned to recognize the smell of infection before she understood simple arithmetic. By the time she turned 16, she had seen more suffering than most people witnessed in a lifetime, and somewhere along the way, she had stopped being afraid of it. Fear, she had learned, was a luxury reserved for people who had something left to lose. Lyra had already lost everything once. What remained was simply the work in front of her, one wound at a time, one patient at a time, without room for hesitation. That was why she had walked toward Ashka without truly weighing the danger the way everyone else around her had. It was not bravery, not exactly. It was the simple fact that she had never learned how to look away from something that was hurting, regardless of how large its teeth were, or how many stories were whispered about it. A soft groan pulled her attention back to the present. Ashka shifted slightly, his massive paw twitching as though caught in the memory of battle, even in sleep. Lyra reached out slowly and rested her palm against his side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath the thick fur. "You're safe now," she murmured. "Whatever happened out there, it's over." The beast's eye opened just a fraction, the amber glow dimmed with exhaustion, and fixed on her for a long moment before drifting closed again. Something about that small gesture settled deep in Lyra's chest, a quiet understanding passing between them that needed no words. She did not know what it meant that a creature capable of tearing apart entire battle lines had chosen to trust her within a matter of hours, but she felt it all the same, a strange thread connecting them that had not existed before that night. Near dawn, Agnes returned with a blanket and a cup of warm broth, settling down beside Lyra, without a word of complaint about the cold or the late hour. The old healer studied the sleeping beast for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the pale light, beginning to creep over the horizon. "My mother used to tell me stories about creatures like this," Agnes said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "She said the old world was full of bonds no one could explain, connections between people and animals that went deeper than training or fear. I always thought they were just stories meant to comfort children." "Maybe they weren't just stories," Lyra said, watching the way the rising sun caught the edges of Ashka's dark fur, turning it briefly gold before settling back into shadow. Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between the girl she had raised and the enormous creature sleeping peacefully beside her, a creature that had terrified an entire army only hours before. "Be careful, child. Whatever this is, it has already caught the attention of the king, and kings do not forget things that surprise them. Sometimes that curiosity turns into gratitude. Sometimes it turns into something far more dangerous." Lyra did not answer right away, her gaze drifting toward the direction Kale had disappeared into the night before, toward the command tents where the king and his advisors were surely already discussing the strange events of the previous evening. She thought about the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his voice had carried more disbelief than anger when he questioned her, and wondered what kind of man could command both an unbeatable army and a creature capable of leveling battlefields, and still look so utterly alone, standing among his own soldiers. "I'm not doing this to gain anything," Lyra finally said. "I only wanted to help him." "I believe you," Agnes replied, patting her knee gently. "But not everyone in that court will see it the same way. Guard yourself, Lyra. Not everything that looks like kindness is received as kindness by people who are used to seeing only power and weakness in the world." As the first true light of morning broke over the ruined battlefield, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Lyra remained where she was, seated beside the sleeping beast, unwilling to leave him until she was certain his fever had not returned and his wounds showed no sign of infection. Around the camp, soldiers began to stir, preparing for the long process of counting losses and rebuilding what the battle had destroyed. Word of what happened during the night had already spread far beyond the healing tents, carried from soldier to soldier until it reached every corner of the camp, growing slightly with each retelling, until some claimed the beast had spoken to her, others claimed she had used some hidden charm to calm it, and a few, the more thoughtful among them, simply said that perhaps the creature had simply recognized something true in her that no one else had bothered to look for. Lyra paid little attention to the rumors swirling around her. She was too tired, too focused on the steady rise and fall of Ashka's massive chest beneath her palm, to worry about what stories were being told about her in tents she would never enter. She did not yet understand that this quiet, exhausted morning beside a sleeping beast marked the beginning of something that would reach far beyond the healing tents, far beyond the war camp itself, into the very heart of the kingdom's throne room. Neither of them knew yet how much that single night would change everything that followed. 3 days after the battle, the order came that no one in the camp expected. Ashka would not travel without Lyra. The great beast had healed enough to walk on his own by the second morning, his wounds closing faster than any of the healers thought possible, Yet the moment the soldiers attempted to lead him toward the wagons bound for the capital, he refused to move. He planted his massive paws in the dirt, lowered his head, and let out a growl so deep it rattled the wooden frames of the nearby tents. Only when Lyra stepped forward and placed her hand against his shoulder did he finally relax enough to follow. Word reached Chaol within minutes. He arrived at the edge of the camp with his cloak still damp from the morning mist. His expression caught somewhere between irritation and fascination. "He has never refused a command before," Chaol said, studying the calm way Ashka pressed his head against Lyra's side. "Not once. In all the years I have raised him." "Maybe he's just used to me now," Lyra offered, though even she did not fully believe the simplicity of that explanation. There was something else happening. Something neither of them had the words to describe yet. A thread of understanding that had formed between healer and beast in the span of a single night, and had only grown stronger since. Chaol studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes searching her face, as though trying to find some hidden trick behind her calm expression. Finally, he exhaled and turned toward one of his guards. "She travels with us," he said simply. "See that she has proper supplies for the journey." And just like that, Lyra's quiet life as a healer's assistant ended, replaced by something far stranger and far more uncertain. The journey to the capital took 4 days, winding through valleys still scarred from years of border conflict, past villages that watched the king's procession pass with a mixture of relief and quiet fear. Lyra rode in a modest wagon near the rear of the convoy, though she spent most of each day walking alongside Ashka instead, unable to bring herself to sit idle while the great beast moved slowly beside her, still favoring his injured side despite his obvious improvement. Agnes had not been permitted to join them, her duties keeping her tied to the healing tents that remained behind to treat soldiers too wounded to travel. Their farewell had been brief but heavy, filled with warnings Lyra suspected she would need to remember far sooner than she wanted to admit. "Trust your instincts," Agnes had told her, gripping her hands tightly before she climbed into the wagon. "But do not trust the court. Palaces are full of smiling faces, hiding sharp teeth, far sharper than anything that creature carries in its jaw." Lyra thought about those words often during the long journey, watching the way soldiers whispered among themselves whenever she passed, the way some made small gestures meant to ward off bad luck, as though she carried some kind of curse simply by walking beside the king's beast without fear. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on the practical tasks in front of her, checking Ashka's wounds each evening, adjusting his diet to help him regain his strength, learning the particular way he tilted his head when something troubled him. On the second evening of the journey, as the convoy set up camp beside a wide, slow river, Lyra found herself sitting near the fire with a bowl of stew she had little appetite for. She had grown used to eating alone since leaving the healing camp, the other servants and soldiers keeping a careful distance from the strange girl the king's beast had chosen. It was during this quiet moment that a man approached her, his boots polished despite the dust of travel, his expression carrying the kind of practiced friendliness she had learned to be wary of. "You must be the healer everyone is talking about," he said, settling onto a log across from her, without waiting for an invitation. "I am Lord Edric, cousin to the king, though he rarely acknowledges the relation these days." Lyra studied him carefully, noting the way his smile did not quite reach his eyes, the way his gaze kept drifting toward Ashka, resting a short distance away, assessing the creature the way a merchant might assess a valuable piece of livestock. "Lyra," she said simply, offering nothing more. "A curious thing you have done, taming the untamable beast." Edric leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something more conspiratorial. "Some in the court are already saying you must have some hidden talent, perhaps even magic, passed down through unknown bloodlines. Others believe it is simply luck, a strange accident that happened to occur at the right moment. What do you believe, healer's girl?" "I believe he was in pain, and I helped him," Lyra replied evenly. "Nothing more complicated than that." Edric's smile widened slightly, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. "How refreshingly simple. Though I suspect the court will not see it that way. Kings surround themselves with advisors who search for hidden meaning in everything, especially anything that threatens the careful balance of power they have spent years arranging. Be careful, Lyra. Sudden favor from a king can be a dangerous gift, one that others may try to take from you, one way or another." He rose before she could respond, offering a slight bow that felt more mocking than respectful, and walked away toward the larger fires where the higher-ranking members of the court had gathered. Lyra watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that she could not quite explain, though she would remember his words far more vividly in the weeks that followed than she could have imagined that night beside the river. The following morning, as the convoy prepared to continue its journey, Chaol approached her, while she checked the bandages along Ashka's side, his presence announced only by the soft crunch of boots against gravel. "Edric spoke with you last night," he said, not quite a question. Lyra glanced up, surprised he had noticed such a small detail among the chaos of breaking camp. "He introduced himself, said he was your cousin." "He is," Chaol confirmed, his jaw tightening slightly. "And he is also ambitious in ways that have caused difficulty within my court more than once. I would advise caution around him, though I suspect Agnes already gave you similar warnings before we left." "She did," Lyra admitted, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "Everyone seems very concerned about warning me these days." Something almost like amusement flickered across Chaol's usually guarded expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. That is often what happens when someone accomplishes something no one expected. People either wish to understand it, or they wish to control it, or they wish to destroy it, before it grows into something they cannot manage. "Which one are you?" Lyra asked, before she could stop herself, the question slipping out with more boldness than she intended. Chaol was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving to Ashka, who had settled comfortably beside Lyra, despite the king's presence, his amber gaze half closed in a way that suggested genuine contentment rather than mere tolerance. It was a sight Chaol had never witnessed before in all the years he had raised the beast from a small, wild creature found abandoned in the northern forests, and the sight of it clearly still unsettled something deep within him. "I am still deciding," he finally said, before turning and walking back toward the front of the convoy, leaving Lyra with more questions than answers, a feeling that was quickly becoming familiar whenever she found herself in the king's presence. The remainder of the journey passed with a strange rhythm settling over the group, the soldiers growing slightly more accustomed to the sight of Lyra walking freely beside the great beast, though the whispers never fully disappeared. She learned the names of a few of the kinder guards, shared quiet meals with an older woman named Margaret, who worked as a seamstress for the royal household, and seemed unbothered by the rumors swirling around the healer's girl, and spent long hours simply observing Ashka's behavior, noting the small signs that told her when he was in pain, when he was anxious, and when, more rarely, he seemed almost at peace. Margaret, the seamstress, found Lyra sitting alone by the fire on the third night, mending a torn sleeve with clumsy stitches that made the older woman chuckle softly and take the needle from her hands. "You handle wounds better than fabric, it seems," Margaret said, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she repaired the tear in only a few moments. "Though I suppose that is a fair trade. Not many people can do both well." "I never had much use for fine sewing," Lyra admitted, watching the fire crackle and pop against the darkening sky. "Agnes taught me healing, because it kept people alive. Sewing dresses never seemed as urgent." Margaret laughed, a warm, easy sound that felt like a small comfort amid the tension that had followed Lyra since Edric's visit the night before. "Fair enough. Though I will say, you have caused quite a stir among the court already, and you have not even set foot in the palace yet. Some of the ladies are already placing wagers on how long you will last once the real politics begin." "That's comforting," Lyra said dryly. "Do not let it trouble you too much." Margaret's expression softened, the teasing fading into something more genuine. "I have served the royal household for over 20 years, longer than most of the current advisors have held their positions. I have seen favorites rise and fall more times than I can count, but I have never seen anything like what happened with that beast. Whatever is happening between you two, child, it is not something ordinary, and ordinary rules may not apply to you the way they apply to everyone else." Lyra considered her words carefully, glancing toward the edge of the camp where Ashka lay resting, his massive form illuminated faintly by the scattered firelight. "Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?" "Both, most likely," Margaret said with a small, knowing smile. "The most interesting things in this world usually are." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the older woman continuing her mending while Lyra watched the flames dance, her mind drifting between worry over what awaited her in the capital, and a strange, quiet excitement she did not fully understand. She had spent so many years simply surviving, moving from one task to another, without much thought for what might come next, that the uncertainty ahead felt almost foreign, a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope, if she allowed herself to name it. Later that night, unable to sleep, Lyra wandered toward the edge of the camp, where Ashka rested beneath the open sky, the stars scattered brightly above them, now that the smoke of the battlefield was far behind. She settled quietly beside him, resting her back against his warm side, and found herself speaking softly into the darkness, telling him about her childhood in the eastern hills, about the parents she barely remembered, about Agnes and the years spent learning to heal instead of simply surviving. She did not know if he understood her words, but he listened, his breathing slow and steady beside her, occasionally shifting to press closer, whenever her voice grew quiet with old grief. It became, in those quiet hours before dawn, less like speaking to a wild creature, and more like speaking to an old friend, who simply could not answer in words, and somehow, that made the confession easier, rather than harder. "I don't know why you chose me," she admitted eventually, her fingers tracing gentle patterns through the thick fur along his neck. "But I'm glad you did." Ashka let out a low, contented rumble, and for the first time since the battle, Lyra felt something close to peace settle over her, even with all the uncertainty still waiting ahead in the capital. On the final evening before they reached the capital, the convoy stopped atop a low ridge that overlooked the sprawling city of Veremore below, its towers rising against the darkening sky, torches already being lit along its walls in preparation for the king's return. Lyra stood beside Ashka, taking in the sight of the place that was about to become her new home, whether she was ready for it or not. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to the beast beside her. Ashka let out a low sound, something between a growl and a sigh, and pressed his massive head gently against her shoulder, nearly knocking her off balance with the sheer weight of the gesture. Lyra laughed softly despite the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, wrapping her arms around as much of his neck as she could reach. "We'll figure this out together," she whispered, "whatever happens next." Behind them, unnoticed in the gathering darkness, Kale stood at a distance, watching the quiet exchange between his beast and the healer's girl, with an expression that mixed wonder, confusion, and something else he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He did not yet have a name for it, but he suspected, with a growing sense of unease, that he would need to find one soon, before it grew into something far too large to ignore. The capital waited below them, its lights flickering like scattered stars fallen to earth, and with it waited a court full of ambition, suspicion, and secrets that would test everything Lyra thought she understood about courage, loyalty, and the strange, unexplainable bonds that sometimes formed between the most unlikely of hearts. None of them, not the king, not the beast, and certainly not Lyra herself, could have predicted just how much that city would demand of them before the truth of their bond was finally revealed to the entire kingdom. The palace gates groaned open before sunrise, and Lyra walked through them beside a creature the entire kingdom feared, into a life she had never asked for, and did not yet know how to navigate. The great hall of Veremore stretched impossibly high above her, its stone pillars carved with images of past kings and their victories, its windows catching the pale morning light and scattering it across polished floors that had never known the tread of muddy boots quite like the ones Lyra now wore. Servants paused mid-task to stare as she passed, some bowing out of confused habit, others simply watching with open suspicion. Ashka walked steadily at her side, his massive paws silent despite his size, his amber eyes scanning the unfamiliar corridors with the same wary alertness Lyra felt in her own chest. She was given quarters near the royal stables, a modest room that smelled faintly of hay and leather, far removed from the grand chambers occupied by the court's actual nobility, though far better than anything she had known in the healing tents. A young servant named Nora, barely older than Lyra herself, was assigned to assist her, though it quickly became clear that Nora's true purpose was to report Lyra's every movement back to someone higher within the palace hierarchy. "You must be exhausted from the journey," Nora said on the first morning, her voice pleasant enough, though her eyes carried the same careful calculation Lyra had noticed in nearly everyone she encountered since arriving. "The Chancellor wishes to speak with you once you have settled in. Elder Nathaniel oversees matters of the court that concern the king's household staff." Lyra had little choice but to agree, and by midday, she found herself standing in a narrow chamber lined with old books and even older scrolls, facing a thin, silver-haired man whose sharp eyes reminded her uncomfortably of a hawk assessing potential prey. "So you are the girl who tamed the king's beast," Elder Nathaniel said, not bothering to rise from his seat behind a heavy wooden desk. Rather unremarkable in appearance for someone causing such disruption within these walls. "I did not mean to cause disruption," Lyra replied carefully. "I only wanted to help him. Intentions matter little in a royal court, child. Only outcomes matter, and the outcome of your actions has already unsettled a balance that took years to establish." Nathaniel steepled his fingers, studying her with open scrutiny. The king's beast has always been a symbol of his strength, his ability to command even the wildest of creatures through sheer force of will and years of careful training. Now half the court whispers that a healer's assistant holds some hidden power over him instead, power that even the king himself cannot explain. Do you understand how dangerous such rumors can become? "I understand that people are afraid of what they don't understand," Lyra said, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "But I am not trying to take anything from anyone. I only care for him because he needed help, and because he seems to trust me. That's all this has ever been." Nathaniel's expression did not soften, though something in his eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of reluctant consideration. "Perhaps that is true. Perhaps it is not. Either way, you would be wise to remember that this court has seen many rise on the strength of the king's favor, and just as many fall when that favor shifted elsewhere. Guard your position carefully, healer's girl. Not everyone here wishes you well." The warning echoed Agnes's words from days before, and Lyra left the chancellor's chamber with a heavier heart than she had entered with, though she refused to let it show on her face, as she made her way back toward the stables where Ashka waited. The days that followed settled into a careful rhythm. Each morning, Lyra rose before dawn to check on Ashka's healing wounds, applying fresh salves and changing bandages, while the great beast remained remarkably patient beneath her careful hands. Afternoons were spent walking him through the palace gardens, partly for his recovery, and partly, Lyra suspected, because the sight of the two of them together had become something the court simply could not stop watching, whispering about, and forming opinions on from a careful distance. Kale visited more often than Lyra expected, though his visits carried an awkward formality at first, as though neither of them quite knew how to exist in each other's presence outside the chaos of the battlefield where their strange connection first began. He would arrive in the early evenings, ostensibly to check on Ashka's progress, though the conversations that followed often stretched far longer than any simple health report required. "He sleeps more peacefully now," Kale observed one evening, watching as Ashka rested contentedly near Lyra's feet, his breathing slow, and even in a way it had not been since long before the battle. "I do not believe I have seen him this calm since he was young, before the training that shaped him into what the kingdom needed him to become." "What was he like then?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious despite the careful distance she still maintained around the king, uncertain of how much familiarity was permitted between someone of her station and someone of his. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as though pulled back through years of memory he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Curious, playful, in his own way, though even then he was larger than any creature had a right to be. "My father found him as a cub, abandoned in the northern forests after some tragedy claimed the rest of his pack. He believed such a creature, raised properly, could become an unmatched weapon for the kingdom's defense." "And did he become that?" Lyra asked softly. "He did," Kale admitted, something heavy settling into his voice. "But I sometimes wonder what was lost in the process. The training required to shape him into what the kingdom needed was not gentle. I do not believe he has ever been treated with true kindness. Not the way you have shown him these past weeks. Not until now." The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than anything Kale had shared before, and Lyra found herself studying him with new understanding, seeing past the crown and the armor to the weight he carried as a man who had shaped a living creature into a weapon out of necessity, and who now seemed to be questioning, for the first time, whether that necessity had cost more than he originally believed. "He trusts you," Lyra said gently. "Whatever happened in his training, that trust is still there. I see it every time you walk into the room, the way his whole body relaxes." Kale's eyes met hers, something raw and uncertain flickering behind his usually guarded expression. I have never been able to give him what you give him so easily. Comfort, gentleness. I have only ever known how to command, not how to comfort. Maybe it's not too late to learn, Lyra offered, surprising herself with the boldness of the suggestion. For a moment, something almost like hope flickered across Cale's face before the familiar guardedness returned, and he rose to leave, murmuring something about matters requiring his attention elsewhere in the palace. But as he reached the doorway, he paused, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite name. "Thank you, Lyra," he said quietly, "for seeing something in him that I stopped believing existed." He left before she could respond, and Lyra sat in the quiet stable for a long while afterward, Ashka's steady breathing the only sound accompanying her thoughts, which had grown far more complicated than she was prepared to admit even to herself. A week into her new life within the palace walls, Lyra found herself drawn to the old library, tucked away in the eastern wing, a quiet, dusty space that few members of the court seemed to visit anymore. She had gone there searching for anything that might explain the strange bond she shared with Ashka, hoping perhaps some old text might offer answers that no one around her seemed willing or able to provide. The librarian, an elderly man named Edmund, who had served the royal household for longer than most people in the palace had been alive, greeted her with mild surprise when she explained what she was searching for. "Bonds between beasts and healers," he mused, stroking his thin beard thoughtfully as he led her toward a shelf tucked into the farthest corner of the room. "That is not a common request these days. Most people who come through these doors want records of trade agreements or genealogies proving their family's claim to some distant title." "I just want to understand what's happening to me," Lyra admitted, watching as he pulled a thick, leather-bound volume from the shelf, its pages yellowed with age. Edmund studied her for a long moment before handing her the book. "There is an old belief, mostly forgotten now, that certain creatures, particularly those raised for war or bred with unusual intelligence, sometimes form bonds, not with the one who trains them, but with the one who first shows them true compassion after enduring great suffering. The old healers called it a mercy bond, though it was considered rare even in ancient times, and many dismissed it as simple superstition." Lyra turned the fragile pages carefully, finding faded illustrations of creatures similar in size and ferocity to Ashka, accompanied by descriptions written in old, formal language that took her a moment to fully understand. According to the text, such bonds were said to form only under specific conditions, when a creature had suffered greatly under the weight of duty or training, and encountered someone who offered comfort without expectation of anything in return. "Does it say what happens once such a bond forms?" she asked, her heart beating a little faster as she read. Edmund's expression grew more solemn. "The old texts suggest such bonds cannot easily be broken, not even by the creature's original master. Some accounts claim the bonded creature would follow their chosen companion above all other commands, even those given by kings or generals. Naturally, such an idea unsettled many in positions of power throughout history, which is likely why the concept faded into obscurity. A creature's loyalty was meant to serve the crown, not shift toward whoever happened to show it kindness." Lyra sat with that information for a long while after Edmund excused himself to attend to other duties, turning the fragile pages over in her mind, long after she had physically closed the book. If what the old text suggested was true, then her bond with Ashka was not simply a passing curiosity that would fade once his wounds fully healed. It was something deeper, something that had the potential to unsettle the very foundation of power that Cale's kingdom had been built upon. She left the library with more questions than she had entered with, the weight of what she had learned pressing heavily against her thoughts as she made her way back through the palace corridors toward the stables. That evening, she mentioned what she had discovered to Cale during his usual visit, watching carefully for his reaction as she described the old concept of a mercy bond. Cale listened in silence, his expression unreadable, until she finished explaining everything Edmund had shared with her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "My father would have called such a bond a threat to be eliminated," he said quietly. He believed absolute control over Ashka was necessary to ensure the beast remained a reliable weapon for the kingdom's defense. If he were still alive, I do not believe he would have allowed this bond to continue, regardless of what good it has done for Ashka's well-being. "And what do you believe?" Lyra asked carefully. Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching Ashka rest peacefully nearby, his massive form curled protectively close to where Lyra sat. "I believe," he said slowly, as though testing the words for the first time, "that perhaps control was never truly the same thing as loyalty. Perhaps what my father built through fear and training, you have somehow built through simple kindness, in only a matter of weeks. I do not know what to do with that realization, but I find I am no longer certain my father's methods were the right ones." The confession seemed to surprise even Cale himself, and he fell silent afterward. Lost in thoughts, Lyra did not press him to share further. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the palace, what it meant to question the foundations of everything one had been taught to believe, having spent her own childhood learning to survive in a world that offered little softness in return. Not everyone in the palace shared Cale's growing appreciation for her presence, however. Word of the private conversations between the king and the healer's assistant spread quickly through the court's whispered networks, reaching ears that viewed the development with far less warmth than curiosity. Lady Beatrice, a widowed noblewoman, who had long positioned her own daughter as a potential match for the unmarried king, made her displeasure known through carefully placed comments during court gatherings that Lyra was occasionally required to attend as part of her new, uncertain status within the palace. "How charming," Lady Beatrice remarked loudly enough to be heard across the dining hall during one such gathering, "that our king now spends his evenings discussing beasts with stable hands rather than attending to matters of actual importance to this kingdom." The comment drew scattered laughter from nearby nobles, though Lyra noticed several others exchanging uneasy glances, unwilling to fully commit to mockery given the uncertain nature of her standing with the king. She said nothing in response, focusing instead on her meal, though the heat rising in her cheeks betrayed the sting of the words regardless of her outward composure. Later that evening, as she made her way back toward the stables through the quiet garden pathways, she found Elder Nathaniel waiting near the fountain, his expression more serious than their previous meeting. "The court grows restless," he said without preamble. "Lady Beatrice is not the only one who views your presence here with concern. There are those who believe your influence over the beast, and perhaps over the king himself, represents something that must be investigated more thoroughly." "Investigated how?" Lyra asked, unease creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to remain composed. "There are old laws concerning unexplained influence over royal property, including creatures bound to the crown," Nathaniel said carefully. "Some members of the council have begun discussing whether such laws might apply to your situation. I tell you this, not as a threat, but as a warning. Whatever bond you share with that creature, you would be wise to be able to explain it clearly, should you ever be asked to do so before the full council." Lyra felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she considered his words, understanding for the first time just how precarious her position truly was within these unfamiliar walls. She was no longer simply a healer's assistant tending to wounds. She had become, without ever intending to, a piece on a board far larger and more dangerous than she had realized, surrounded by players who had spent their entire lives learning how to move such pieces to their own advantage. Elsewhere in the palace that same evening, in a private chamber lit by a single flickering candle, Lord Edric sat across from Lady Beatrice, a glass of wine untouched in front of him as the two spoke in low, careful voices. "The Chancellor has already begun raising concerns among the council," Edric said, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "It seems he shares our unease about the healer's growing influence, though his reasons are far more concerned with tradition than personal ambition." "Good," Lady Beatrice replied, swirling her own drink absently. "Whatever his reasons, they serve our purpose well enough. If the council can be convinced that the girl represents a genuine threat to the crown's authority over the beast, they will have no choice but to act, regardless of how the king himself feels about the matter." "And if the king resists?" Edric asked, watching her carefully. Lady Beatrice's smile turned sharp. "Then we will need to find a way to demonstrate, quite clearly, that her presence brings more danger than benefit. Kings can be remarkably stubborn when their hearts become involved, but even the most stubborn heart will reconsider when faced with undeniable proof of harm." Edric said nothing further, though the calculating gleam in his eyes suggested he was already turning the possibilities over in his mind, searching for the right moment, the right method, to prove exactly the kind of danger Lady Beatrice was suggesting existed. Neither of them spoke of what such proof might actually require, though the unspoken understanding between them carried a weight that would have chilled Lyra to her core had she been present to witness it. Back in the quiet stable, Unaware of the conversation unfolding elsewhere in the palace, Lyra found a small measure of comfort in an unexpected friendship that had begun to form over the past several days. Clara, a young kitchen worker who occasionally brought scraps of meat for Ashka on Lyra's behalf, had taken to lingering near the stables during her breaks, her easy laughter and genuine curiosity offering a welcome contrast to the careful suspicion Lyra encountered nearly everywhere else within the palace walls. "You know, most of the kitchen staff think you're either incredibly brave or a little bit mad," Clara said one afternoon, watching with wide eyes as Lyra calmly brushed dirt and debris from Ashka's thick fur. "Personally, I think it's a bit of both, and I mean that as a compliment." "I'll take it," Lyra replied with a small laugh, grateful for the lightness Clara brought into her increasingly complicated days. "For what it's worth," Clara added, her expression growing more serious. "Not everyone in this palace is against you. Some of us think it's rather wonderful what you've done. This place could use a little more kindness, if you ask me. Too many people here have forgotten how to be simply decent to one another." Lyra held on to those words carefully in the days that followed, a small anchor of warmth amid the growing storm of suspicion and political maneuvering she could sense building around her, even if she did not yet fully understand its shape or how close it had already come to finding its target. That night, sitting beside Ashka in the quiet darkness of the stable, she found herself speaking aloud again, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what I've gotten us into," she admitted, resting her head against his warm side, "but I promise I won't leave you, no matter what they decide to do about it." Ashka's tail thumped softly against the straw-covered floor, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the stable walls, unseen and unheard, the careful machinery of court politics continued turning, drawing Lyra further into a conflict she had never asked to be part of, but from which there would soon be no possibility of retreat. The summons arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a palace guard, whose stiff formality told Lyra everything she needed to know before he even spoke a single word. "The council requests your presence in the throne room within the hour," he said, his eyes carefully avoiding hers, as though he did not wish to be associated with whatever was about to unfold. Lyra's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the simple dress Margaret had given her for such occasions, her mind racing through everything Elder Nathaniel had warned her about weeks earlier. She had known this moment might come eventually, but knowing it and facing it were entirely different experiences, and no amount of preparation could fully calm the anxious pounding of her heart as she made her way through the palace corridors toward the grand throne room. Ashka sensed her distress before she even reached the heavy double doors, his low whine carrying down the hallway as she left him behind in the stables, unable to bring him into a council meeting no matter how much she wished for his steady presence beside her. The throne room felt impossibly large as she entered, its high ceilings and towering pillars designed specifically to make anyone standing on its polished floors feel small and insignificant before the gathered power of the kingdom's ruling council. Kale sat upon the throne at the far end of the room, his expression carefully neutral, though Lyra caught the tightness around his eyes that suggested he was far from at ease with whatever was about to take place. Elder Nathaniel stood near the front of the assembled council members, flanked by several other advisors Lyra did not recognize, along with Lady Beatrice, whose thin smile did little to hide the satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. Lord Edric stood slightly apart from the others, his posture relaxed in a way that felt deliberately calculated, as though he wanted everyone in the room to believe he had no particular stake in whatever was about to unfold. "Lyra of the Healing Tents," Nathaniel began formally, his voice echoing slightly against the stone walls. "You have been summoned before this council to address growing concerns regarding your unprecedented influence over the creature known as Ashka, a beast bound by ancient law to serve the crown alone. I have not tried to take him from the crown," Lyra said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the weight of every gaze fixed upon her. "I only cared for his wounds when no one else could get close enough to help him. And yet," Lady Beatrice interjected smoothly, "the creature now follows your commands as readily as it follows the king's own orders, does it not? Some among us find that rather concerning, given the beast's capacity for destruction, should such loyalty ever be turned against the crown it was bred to protect." A murmur rippled through the gathered council members, and Lyra felt the ground beneath her growing more precarious with each passing moment. She glanced toward Kale, searching for some sign of support, though he remained silent, his expression unreadable as he watched the proceedings unfold from his elevated seat. Ashka has never acted against the crown, Lyra said firmly, refusing to let her voice waver despite the fear tightening in her chest. He has only ever shown loyalty, both to the king and, apparently, to me. I do not see how kindness toward an injured creature constitutes a threat to anyone. Kindness is rarely the true concern in matters such as this, Nathaniel replied, his tone measured and careful. The true concern is control, and whether a bond formed through simple compassion might one day override the training and command structures this kingdom has relied upon for generations. We are not accusing you of malicious intent, child. We are simply asking whether such an unprecedented bond can be trusted to remain harmless indefinitely. Before Lyra could formulate a response, Cale finally rose from his throne, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the room. This council forgets an important detail in its concerns, he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast space. Ashka's loyalty to me has never wavered, even as his bond with Lyra has grown. I have witnessed this myself, on multiple occasions. He does not choose between us. He simply trusts both of us, for different reasons, and I fail to see how expanded trust constitutes a weakness rather than a strength. With respect, my lord, Lady Beatrice said carefully, though her tone carried an edge beneath its practiced politeness. Trust in a beast, capable of such destruction, should not be divided so easily, particularly not with someone whose background and true intentions remain largely unknown to this court. My intentions have never changed, Lyra said, drawing herself up despite every instinct, urging her to shrink beneath the weight of so many skeptical stares. I came here to heal a wounded creature. I never asked for a place within this court, never sought influence over anyone, and certainly never intended to threaten the stability of this kingdom. If the council wishes to test my intentions, I welcome whatever proof you believe would settle these concerns. Her declaration seemed to surprise several members of the council, murmurs shifting from suspicion toward something closer to grudging respect. Cale's eyes met hers across the room, something like pride flickering briefly across his features before he addressed the council once more. Lyra will remain responsible for Ashka's continued care, he said firmly, leaving no room for argument in his tone. This council's concerns have been heard and will be monitored, but I will not dismiss someone who has done nothing but demonstrate genuine care for a creature this kingdom owes a great deal to. This matter is settled, for now. The council reluctantly accepted the king's ruling, though the tension in the room remained palpable as the gathering slowly dispersed. Lady Beatrice offered Lyra a final cold glance before sweeping out of the throne room, while Lord Edric lingered a moment longer, his gaze calculating in a way that left Lyra feeling distinctly uneasy despite the apparent resolution of the council's concerns. Cale approached her once the room had mostly emptied, his expression softening from the commanding authority he had displayed moments before into something more personal, more uncertain. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I think so," Lyra admitted, releasing a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you for defending me in there. I wasn't certain you would." Something flickered across Cale's face, a mixture of guilt and determination that Lyra did not fully understand. "I should have spoken sooner, before they had the chance to corner you the way they did. I apologize for that hesitation." "Why did you hesitate?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious, despite the exhaustion settling heavily over her after the tense confrontation. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the empty throne behind him, as though searching for words among memories of countless similar council meetings he had endured throughout his reign. "Because defending you publicly means acknowledging something I have not yet fully allowed myself to examine privately," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "And once acknowledged, such things become far more difficult to ignore." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to fully address, and after a long moment of silence, Cale simply nodded toward the door, gesturing for her to follow him back toward the stables, where Ashka waited anxiously for her return. That evening, as Lyra sat beside the great beast, recounting the tense confrontation with the council, in a soft voice, meant to reassure him, as much as herself, she found herself replaying Cale's words over and over in her mind, uncertain what to make of the growing complexity of feelings, tangled somewhere between fear, gratitude, and something else entirely, that she was not yet brave enough to name. 2 days later, Kale found Lyra walking alone through the palace gardens during a rare quiet hour, Ashka trailing a short distance behind her, sniffing curiously at the rows of flowering shrubs that lined the winding stone pathways. The tension of the council meeting had not fully faded from either of their minds, though the peaceful setting offered a welcome reprieve from the weight of politics that had settled over them both in recent days. "I did not expect to find you out here," Kale said, falling into step beside her, as Ashka rumbled a low greeting without breaking stride. "I needed air that didn't smell like old parchment and suspicion," Lyra admitted with a tired smile. "The gardens seemed like the safest place to find it." Kale chuckled softly, a sound Lyra realized she had rarely heard from him, genuine amusement, rather than the careful, measured tones he used in most of their interactions. "A fair assessment. I often come here myself, when the weight of the throne room becomes too much to bear in silence." They walked together in comfortable quiet for a while, past beds of pale blue flowers Lyra did not recognize, and a small fountain, where birds splashed and called to one another, oblivious to the political tensions unfolding within the palace walls surrounding them. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said eventually, glancing sideways at him. "Of course. Why does it matter so much to you, what happens to me? I understand caring about Ashka's well-being. He's yours, in a sense, even if that word feels wrong somehow now. But why defend me the way you did in there, when it would have been so much easier to simply let the council decide my fate and move on?" Kale slowed his steps, considering the question with obvious care before answering. "I have spent most of my life learning how to command, how to lead, how to make decisions based on strategy and necessity, rather than feeling. My father raised me that way, believing sentiment made rulers weak and vulnerable to manipulation. For a long time, I believed him. And now?" Lyra prompted gently. "Now I watch you care for a creature that terrifies everyone else in this kingdom, simply because you cannot bear to see anything suffer without trying to help, and I find myself questioning nearly everything I was taught to believe about strength and weakness." He paused near the fountain, watching the water ripple gently in the afternoon light. "You have shown more courage in a handful of weeks than most of my advisors have shown in years of careful political maneuvering. And you did it without any desire for power or recognition. That is rare, Lyra. Rarer than you seem to understand." Lyra felt heat rising in her cheeks at the unexpected sincerity of his words, uncertain how to respond to praise so different from anything she had experienced in her difficult solitary life before arriving at the war camp weeks ago. "I only did what felt right," she said quietly. "I never expected it to matter this much to anyone." "It matters," Kale said simply, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "More than I think either of us fully realized until today." Ashka, sensing the charged silence stretching between them, nudged his massive head between them both, breaking the moment with a low, almost mischievous rumble that made Lyra laugh despite herself, the tension dissolving into something lighter and more comfortable. "I believe he thinks we have been standing still for far too long," Kale said, reaching out to scratch behind the beast's ear with an easy familiarity that spoke of years of bond between them, even if that bond had recently grown to include someone else. They continued their walk through the gardens as the afternoon light softened toward evening, their conversation drifting toward lighter topics, Kale sharing small memories from his childhood before the weight of the crown settled fully upon his shoulders, Lyra offering stories of her years learning healing under Agnes's careful guidance. It was, Lyra realized, as the sun began to set behind the palace's tallest towers, the first time since arriving in the capital that she had felt something close to genuine ease, rather than the constant, careful vigilance that had defined nearly every other moment since her arrival. That fragile peace, however, would not last long. Outside the stable walls, unseen in the gathering darkness, Lord Edric stood watching the lit windows with quiet calculation, already turning over new plans in his mind, plans that would require far more drastic measures than mere council meetings, if he hoped to remove the obstacle that Lyra had so unexpectedly become to his carefully laid ambitions within the kingdom's shifting balance of power. The scream came just before midnight, sharp and sudden, tearing through the quiet of the palace stables and shattering whatever peace remained from the gentle afternoon in the gardens days before. Lyra bolted upright from her cot, her heart already pounding before her mind fully registered what had woken her. Another scream followed, closer this time, accompanied by the frantic sound of hooves against stone and the deep, furious roar of a beast pushed beyond its limits. She was on her feet and running, before she consciously decided to move, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor as she raced toward the source of the chaos. The stable yard, when she reached it, was pure pandemonium. 2 guards lay crumpled near the fence, one clutching his arm at an unnatural angle, the other simply unconscious, a thin trail of blood trickling from a wound at his temple. Ashka stood in the center of the yard, his massive body coiled with barely contained fury, his amber eyes blazing with a wildness Lyra had not seen since the night she first found him wounded on the battlefield. "What happened?" Lyra demanded, grabbing the arm of a nearby stable hand who stood frozen at the edge of the chaos. "Someone came in through the back gate," the young man stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "They had a torch. Tried to get close to him while he was resting. He just exploded. I've never seen him like this, not even during the worst of the training exercises." Lyra's blood ran cold as she took in the scene more fully, noting the scorched patch of ground near the stable entrance, the overturned water trough, the way Ashka's muscles trembled with barely restrained violence even as his eyes tracked toward her approaching figure. Someone had deliberately provoked him, and from the careful placement of the torch marks and the timing of the guards' positions, it did not look like an accident or a simple act of foolish curiosity. "Ashka," she called softly, forcing calm into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "It's me. You're safe now." The great beast's head swung toward her, his growl fading slightly at the sound of her voice, though his body remained tense, coiled like a spring, ready to release at the slightest additional provocation. Lyra approached slowly, hands raised, ignoring the frantic warnings from the guards who had recovered enough to shout at her to stay back. "I'm here," she said softly, closing the distance between them, despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. "Whatever happened, it's over now. You're safe." Ashka's trembling slowly eased as she drew closer, his massive head lowering until it rested against her shoulder, nearly knocking her off balance with the desperate weight of the gesture. She wrapped her arms around as much of his neck as she could manage, feeling the frantic pounding of his heart gradually slow beneath her touch, whispered reassurances falling from her lips without conscious thought. It was in this position that Kale found them minutes later, having been roused from his own quarters by the commotion, his expression shifting rapidly from alarm to fury as he took in the scene before him. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled anger that made even the recovering guards flinch. "We don't know, my lord," one of the guards managed, still clutching his injured arm. "They came from the shadows, moved quickly. We never got a clear look before Ashka reacted." Kale's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage, his eyes eventually settling on Lyra, still holding Ashka's massive head against her shoulder as the beast slowly calmed beneath her steady presence. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing the distance between them in quick strides. "I'm fine," Lyra assured him, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline still coursing through her system. "I was asleep when it happened. By the time I got here, he was already like this." Kale's gaze swept the stable yard once more, cataloging every detail with the sharp precision of a man who had spent years learning to read the aftermath of violence. "This was deliberate," he said grimly. "Someone wanted to provoke him, likely hoping he would cause enough damage or injury to justify the council's concerns about his continued freedom, or perhaps hoping he would harm you directly in the chaos." The implication settled heavily over Lyra, cold dread pooling in her stomach as she considered just how close the situation had come to far greater tragedy. If she had been sleeping closer to the stables, if Ashka's fury had turned even slightly in a different direction before she arrived to calm him, the outcome could have been catastrophic, not just for her, but for the fragile trust that had begun forming between the beast and the kingdom that both feared and depended upon his strength. "Increase the guard around this area immediately," Kale ordered, turning to address the stable master who had arrived amid the chaos, his expression grim with the weight of responsibility. "No one enters this yard without explicit permission from either myself or Lyra directly. I want a full investigation into how someone managed to breach security enough to reach him undetected." As the guards moved to secure the area and tend to their injured comrades, Kale remained beside Lyra and Ashka, his earlier fury settling into something quieter, more troubled. "This is my fault," he said softly, more to himself than to her. I should have anticipated that the council's suspicions would eventually turn into action. I underestimated how far certain members of my court would go to protect what they perceive as the proper order of things. You couldn't have known someone would try something like this, Lyra said, though her own voice carried little conviction, the shock of the night's events still settling unevenly through her thoughts. I should have known, Cale insisted, his eyes dark with self-directed anger. I have seen this pattern before. Ambition disguised as concern for tradition. I simply did not expect it to escalate so quickly, or so dangerously. They stood together in the aftermath, the stable yard slowly emptying as guards finished their initial investigation, and the injured were carried away for treatment. Ashka's breathing gradually returning to something closer to normal, beneath Lyra's steady, patient care. It was nearly dawn by the time the immediate crisis had fully passed, the first pale light of morning beginning to creep over the palace walls, as exhaustion finally caught up with all three of them. You should rest, Cale said eventually, though he made no move to leave her side. Whatever happened tonight, we will find whoever is responsible, and they will face consequences for endangering both you and Ashka. Will you stay? Lyra asked before she could stop herself, the question slipping out with more vulnerability than she intended, born from the lingering fear still coursing through her exhausted body. Just until he settles fully. I don't think either of us can handle being alone right now. Cale's expression softened, something tender flickering behind his usually guarded eyes. I will stay as long as you need me to, he said quietly, settling down beside her in the hay-scattered dirt of the stable yard, close enough that his shoulder brushed against hers, as they both kept watch over the slowly calming beast between them. They sat together in silence as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, the earlier violence of the night feeling almost like a distant nightmare in the peaceful light of morning. Yet Lyra knew, with a certainty that settled heavily in her chest, that whoever had orchestrated the night's chaos would not simply give up after a single failed attempt. The danger had only just begun to reveal itself, and she suspected, with growing unease, that far greater trials awaited them before this conflict finally reached its resolution. By mid-morning, the palace guard had managed to track down the man responsible for the intrusion, a hired laborer named Oswin, who had been paid a substantial sum to slip into the stable yard under cover of darkness. He was brought before Cale in a small chamber adjacent to the throne room, his hands bound, his face pale with the realization of just how much trouble he had brought upon himself. "Who paid you?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying a cold authority that made even the hardened guards standing watch shift uncomfortably. "I never saw a face, my lord," Oswin stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the door, as though hoping for some impossible escape. "The instructions came through a messenger, along with payment. I was told only to provoke the beast, to make it appear dangerous and uncontrollable before witnesses. I swear I did not know anyone would be hurt. I was told the guards would be elsewhere that night." "Someone knew the guard rotations," Cale said grimly, turning to address Nathaniel, who had joined the interrogation, with visible unease etched across his aged features. "That information is not easily obtained without connections within this very palace. I will investigate immediately," Nathaniel said, though something in his tone suggested he already harbored suspicions he was reluctant to voice aloud in the crowded chamber. "This is a serious breach of security, regardless of who orchestrated it." Lyra, standing quietly near the back of the chamber where she had been permitted to observe the proceedings, studied Oswin's frightened face carefully, searching for any detail that might hint at the identity of whoever had truly orchestrated the attack. "Did the messenger give any indication of rank or station?" she asked, drawing surprised glances from the guards unaccustomed to her voice, carrying weight in such formal proceedings. Oswin hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of revealing more against the consequences of remaining silent. "The coin I received," he finally admitted, "bore a seal I did not recognize myself, though the man who delivered the payment wore fine clothes beneath a plain traveling cloak, the kind of disguise someone might use if they wished to appear common, while actually holding a higher station." Cale's eyes narrowed sharply at this detail, his gaze flickering briefly toward Nathaniel, before settling back on the frightened prisoner. "Take him to the holding cells. Ensure he is treated fairly, but watched closely. I want to know everything he remembers about this messenger, before the day is through." As the guards led Oswin away, Kale turned to Lyra, his expression heavy with the weight of unwelcome suspicion. Fine clothes beneath common disguise, he repeated quietly. That narrows the possibilities considerably, though I have no proof yet strong enough to act upon my suspicions. You think it's someone within the court, Lyra said, though it was not truly a question. I fear it, Kale admitted. But fear and proof are different things, and I cannot afford to accuse a member of my own council without evidence strong enough to withstand challenge. Such an accusation, if wrong, would fracture trust within this court beyond repair. The uncertainty hung heavily between them as they left the chamber together, walking in troubled silence back toward the stables where Ashka waited, still slightly restless despite the passing hours since the previous night's chaos. Lyra found herself watching the palace corridors with new wariness, aware now that danger could come from faces she passed every day without suspicion, hidden behind polite smiles and careful words. That afternoon, Nathaniel sought her out privately, his expression carrying none of the cold formality from their first meeting weeks earlier. Instead, genuine concern shadowed his aged features as he found her sitting quietly beside Ashka in the newly reinforced stable yard. I owe you an apology, he said, surprising her with the admission. My earlier warnings were meant to protect the traditions of this court, but I did not anticipate they might embolden someone toward genuine violence. Whatever concerns I hold about the nature of your bond with this creature, I never wished harm upon you, child. Thank you, Lyra said softly, genuinely touched by the unexpected sincerity in his words. Do you have any idea who might be responsible? Nathaniel's expression grew more guarded, though not unkind. I have suspicions I am not yet prepared to voice aloud, even to the king himself. Court politics are a delicate business, and false accusations can be as damaging as the crimes themselves. But know this, Lyra. Whatever occurs in the coming days, I will do everything within my power to ensure your safety, and the safety of that remarkable creature beside you. Some bonds, I am beginning to understand, deserve protection rather than suspicion. His words offered a small measure of comfort amid the growing unease that had settled over the palace since the previous night's attack, though Lyra could not shake the feeling that the true danger still lay ahead, hidden behind careful smiles and patient, calculating ambition that would not be so easily deterred by a single failed attempt. Elsewhere in the palace, in a chamber far removed from the chaos of the stable yard, Lord Edric received the news of the failed provocation with quiet, calculating displeasure, already turning his thoughts toward a far more elaborate and dangerous plan, one that would not rely on hired hands sneaking through shadows, but on something far more difficult for the king to dismiss or defend against. The beast did not harm the girl, he murmured to himself, staring into the flickering candlelight of his private study. Perhaps a more direct approach is required, one that leaves no room for doubt about the danger she represents to this kingdom's stability. Lady Beatrice arrived shortly after, slipping quietly through the side entrance of his study, her expression carrying none of the polished composure she displayed so carefully within the public halls of the court. Oswin has been captured, she said without preamble, worry sharpening her voice. If he speaks of the payment, of the description he was given, suspicion will fall toward us both soon enough. He knows nothing of true value, Edric replied smoothly, though a flicker of tension crossed his features despite his outward calm. A common laborer paid through intermediaries cannot trace a clear line back to either of us, provided we remain patient and avoid any hasty actions that might draw further attention. Patience has already cost us one failed attempt, Beatrice snapped, pacing the length of the small study with barely restrained agitation. The council saw the king defend her openly. Nathaniel grows more sympathetic toward her by the day, if the rumors reaching my ladies are to be believed. We are running out of allies within this court, Edric, and running out of time before her position becomes too secure to challenge through any means available to us. Edric rose slowly from his seat, moving to the narrow window that overlooked the distant stable yard, its damaged fencing still visible even from this distance in the fading afternoon light. Then we require something undeniable, he said quietly, his voice carrying a colder edge than before. Something that cannot be explained away by sentiment or a king's growing affection. If a private provocation failed to reveal the beast's true danger, then perhaps a public one will succeed where secrecy could not. Beatrice's pacing slowed, curiosity replacing some of her earlier agitation. What are you suggesting? Patience, my lady, Edric replied, a thin, humorless smile crossing his face as he turned back toward her. All things in their proper time. But know this. The Founding Day celebrations approach within a matter of weeks, when the entire court, and much of the kingdom's nobility, will gather within these very walls. What better stage could there be to demonstrate, before the eyes of everyone who matters, exactly the kind of danger that Healer's girl and her precious beast truly represent? The candlelight flickered between them as the full weight of his implications settled into the quiet room, a plan already taking shape that would demand far more than hired hands and hidden coin, one that would risk everything on a single, decisive moment before the assembled might of the entire kingdom's ruling class. Whatever plan was forming behind his calculating eyes, it promised to bring far greater danger than the chaos of that long, terrifying night, and neither Lyra nor Cale yet understood how close they stood to the true heart of the conspiracy, quietly unfolding around them within the palace's carefully guarded walls. In the days following the attack on the stables, something quietly shifted between Lyra and Cale, a closeness that neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, but that both seemed to welcome without hesitation. Cale began visiting the stables each evening, without pretense of official business, no longer bothering to disguise his visits as concern for Ashka's recovery alone. He would arrive as the sun began to set, sometimes bringing simple food from the kitchens to share, other times simply sitting quietly beside Lyra as she tended to the various small tasks that filled her days, content in a silence that felt increasingly comfortable rather than awkward. "You seem lighter this evening," Lyra observed one such evening, noticing the way the tension around Cale's shoulders had eased slightly, compared to the heavy weight he usually carried after long days of council meetings and matters of state. "The investigation into Oswin's testimony has yielded a few small leads," Cale admitted, settling onto the low bench Lyra had claimed as her usual seat within the stable. "Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to narrow my suspicions considerably. I find some relief in feeling as though progress is finally being made, however slowly." "Do you truly believe it was someone within the court?" Lyra asked, though the question had become almost rhetorical between them after their earlier conversation on the matter. "I do," Cale said grimly. "Though proving it remains a challenge I have not yet solved. Whoever orchestrated this is careful, patient, willing to use others as instruments to avoid direct implication. It is the kind of patience that only comes from someone accustomed to playing long, careful political games." Lyra considered his words as she finished applying a fresh salve to a small scrape along Ashka's front leg, the great beast having grown so accustomed to her careful touch that he barely stirred from his relaxed position sprawled across the fresh straw covering the stable floor. "Whoever it is, they must feel threatened by something specific about my presence here. Otherwise, why go to such lengths to remove me? Perhaps they feel threatened by the same thing I find myself unable to stop thinking about," Cale said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "And what is that?" Lyra asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, had suspected it for weeks now, ever since that quiet evening in the garden when something unspoken had passed between them beside the fountain. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward Ashka before returning to her face, searching, uncertain, more vulnerable than she had ever seen the composed, commanding king who had first questioned her beside his wounded beast weeks earlier. "That perhaps my heart has begun to recognize something my mind has been reluctant to fully accept," he said softly. "That you have become important to me, in ways that extend far beyond your care for Ashka alone." The confession hung in the quiet, stable air between them, and Lyra felt her own heart racing at the raw honesty of his words, uncertain how to respond to feelings she had been carefully avoiding examining too closely within her own heart, aware of how complicated, how dangerous, such feelings could become, given the vast difference in their stations, and the political turmoil already swirling around her presence in the palace. "Cale," she began softly, uncertain how to continue. "I do not expect anything from you," he said quickly, misreading her hesitation as reluctance. "I understand the complications such feelings would bring, both for you and for the stability of this kingdom. I only wish to be honest with you, given everything we have faced together these past weeks." "That's not what I was going to say," Lyra said gently, reaching out to rest her hand against his, the simple contact sending a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill settling over the stable yard outside. "I find myself thinking of you, far more often than I probably should. given everything Agnes warned me about before I left the healing camp. I did not expect any of this, Cale. Not the beast, not the palace, and certainly not you." Something like relief and wonder mixed together in Cale's expression as he turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together, with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the fierce reputation he carried throughout the kingdom. "Then perhaps we are both equally unprepared for whatever this has become," he said softly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual guarded composure. Ashka, sensing the shift in atmosphere between them, let out a low, contented rumble, his tail thumping softly against the straw, as though offering his own quiet approval of the moment unfolding beside him. Lyra laughed softly at the timing, some of the tension easing from her shoulders for the first time in what felt like days. "He approves, it seems," she said, glancing toward the great beast with fond amusement. "He has always had good instincts," Cale replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles against the back of her hand. "Perhaps I should have trusted them sooner, rather than spending so many weeks trying to convince myself that what I felt was simply gratitude or curiosity, rather than something far deeper." They remained together in the quiet stable as evening deepened into full night, the weight of court politics and hidden conspiracies momentarily forgotten in favor of the fragile, precious warmth growing between them. It would not last, Lyra knew, given everything still unresolved regarding the attack on Ashka and the unknown enemy, still lurking somewhere within the palace's careful web of ambition and tradition. But for this single evening, she allowed herself the simple comfort of hope, something she had rarely permitted herself throughout her difficult solitary life, before Ashka's amber eyes had first met hers on that chaotic battlefield weeks earlier. The following morning, Clara found Lyra humming softly to herself while sweeping the stable floor, a small, unguarded smile lingering on her face that had nothing to do with her usual careful composure around the palace staff. "Well, someone is in a good mood," Clara observed, leaning against the stable door with a knowing grin. "Care to share what has put such color in your cheeks, or shall I simply guess based on which direction you keep glancing toward the palace?" Lyra felt heat rush to her face, though she could not fully suppress her own smile at Clara's teasing tone. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the words carried little conviction. "Of course you don't," Clara laughed, pushing off from the doorframe to help with the sweeping, despite having no actual duty, requiring her presence in the stables. "The whole kitchen is already whispering about how the king has been seen leaving the stables at unusually late hours, looking considerably less burdened than he has in years. Margaret says she has not seen him smile so freely since before his father passed." "It's complicated," Lyra admitted, setting aside the broom to sit on the low bench, Ashka immediately shifting to rest his head against her knee, as though sensing her need for comfort amid the whirlwind of new feelings she was still learning to navigate. "There's so much standing between us, the court, the traditions, everything Nathaniel and even Cale himself have warned me about, regarding how dangerous sudden favor can become." Clara settled beside her, her earlier teasing softening into genuine warmth. "Complications have never stopped good things from being worth pursuing, Lyra. Trust me on this. My own parents faced plenty of disapproval when they married outside their expected stations, yet 20 years later, they remain happier than most nobles I have ever served. Sometimes the things worth having require a bit of struggle to hold on to properly." Lyra found comfort in her friend's simple wisdom, though the underlying worry about the still unidentified enemy within the court remained a persistent shadow at the edges of her newfound happiness. She had not forgotten Nathaniel's careful warnings, nor the frightening night when Ashka's fury had nearly caused far greater tragedy than a handful of injured guards. Whatever peace she had found in Cale's company felt fragile, precious, and uncertain, balanced precariously, atop dangers she could sense but not yet fully identify. That evening, as Cale once again joined her in the quiet stable, their conversation drifted toward deeper, more personal territory than they had previously allowed themselves to explore. Lyra found herself asking about his mother, a subject she had noticed he rarely mentioned, despite speaking occasionally of his father's harsh training methods and exacting standards. "She died when I was young," Cale said quietly, his gaze distant as memory pulled him backward through years he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "Before my father's methods had fully hardened either of us, I remember her as gentle, patient, the kind of person who found joy in small things my father considered unnecessary weaknesses. I sometimes wonder if he became harsher after losing her, as though grief transformed itself into an even stricter devotion to strength and control. "I'm sorry," Lyra said softly, reaching for his hand without conscious thought, the gesture feeling entirely natural despite how recently such intimacy had become part of their relationship. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially so young. "It was," Cale admitted. "Though I have not thought of her so clearly in years, not until recently." His eyes met hers with quiet significance. "You remind me of her, in certain ways. The way you refuse to look away from suffering, the gentleness you offer so freely, despite everything this world has cost you already. I believe she would have liked you very much, had circumstances allowed you to meet." The comparison touched Lyra deeply, understanding the weight of vulnerability required for Cale to share such a comparison, given how carefully guarded his heart had remained throughout their growing closeness. She squeezed his hand gently, offering silent comfort rather than words that felt inadequate to the moment's tenderness. News of the growing closeness between the king and the healer's girl inevitably spread through the palace within days, carried along the same whispered networks that had first spread rumors of her unprecedented bond with Ashka. Reactions varied considerably depending on who spoke of it. Some servants, like Clara and Margaret, expressed quiet delight at seeing genuine warmth finally entering the king's guarded life. Others within the noble circles reacted with far less enthusiasm, viewing the development as yet another troubling sign of instability, threatening the careful order they had spent years cultivating within the court's political landscape. Lady Beatrice received the news with barely concealed fury, her carefully cultivated hopes for her own daughter's eventual marriage to the king crumbling further with each passing day that Lyra remained within the palace walls, growing steadily more beloved by both the beast and the king she had somehow managed to capture the heart of. "This cannot be allowed to continue," she hissed to Edric during a hurried, private meeting held in the seclusion of the palace's eastern gardens, far from prying ears. "If the king intends to make his affections public, our window for action grows shorter with each passing day." "The Founding Day celebration approaches within the fortnight," Edric reminded her, his patience wearing thin at her mounting agitation. "All the pieces we require will be in place by then. A public demonstration, before witnesses too numerous and too powerful to dismiss or silence afterward. Trust in the plan, Beatrice. Patience has served us well thus far, despite your growing impatience." "And if the plan fails, as the previous attempt did?" Beatrice pressed, unable to fully mask the desperation creeping into her voice. Edric's expression turned cold, calculating in a way that sent an involuntary shiver through even his hardened co-conspirator. "It will not fail," he said with quiet certainty. "This time, I intend to ensure the beast has no choice in how it responds, regardless of whatever unnatural bond it has formed with that healer's girl. Some instincts, my lady, run far deeper than mere affection, no matter how carefully cultivated." Whatever cruel mechanism Edric had devised remained unspoken between them, though the cold certainty in his voice left little doubt that the coming celebration would bring far greater danger than either Lyra or Cale currently anticipated. Danger that threatened not only Lyra's growing place within the palace, but potentially her very life, along with the fragile trust she had worked so hard to build with the magnificent, misunderstood creature who had first recognized something true in her on that long, chaotic night beside the battlefield. A heavy rain fell over the palace the night Cale finally told Lyra the full truth about Ashka's origins, a story he admitted he had never shared completely with anyone else in the many years since the beast had come into his life. They sat together in the stable, the sound of rain drumming steadily against the roof above them, a single lantern casting warm, flickering light across the straw-covered floor, where Ashka lay curled contentedly nearby, occasionally lifting his head to watch them both with quiet, attentive eyes. "My father did not simply find him abandoned in the northern forests, as the official story claims," Cale began, his voice low and measured, as though even now, years later, the memory carried weight he was reluctant to fully release. "The truth is considerably darker. Ashka's entire pack was slaughtered by hunters, seeking to sell their pelts and claws to wealthy collectors who valued such rare creatures as trophies, rather than living beings. He was the only survivor, a cub barely old enough to walk properly, found hiding beneath the bodies of his own family." Lyra felt her chest tighten at the image his words conjured, glancing toward Ashka, with fresh understanding of the deep, old grief that likely still lingered somewhere within the great creature's memory, buried beneath years of training and duty. My father saw an opportunity rather than a tragedy, Cale continued, bitterness creeping into his voice. A creature already traumatized, already isolated from its own kind, would be easier to shape into an obedient weapon, he believed. The training that followed was not cruel in any way that violated law, but it was cold, methodical, designed to strip away anything resembling natural instinct or emotion in favor of absolute obedience to command. That's horrible, Lyra whispered, her hand instinctively finding its way to rest against Ashka's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her palm. It worked, in its way, Cale said grimly. Ashka became exactly what my father intended, an unmatched weapon of war, loyal only to command, seemingly incapable of the kind of natural bonds his own kind would have formed in the wild. I inherited him upon my father's death, along with the responsibility of maintaining that same rigid control, believing it necessary for the kingdom's continued security. But you didn't continue it exactly as your father intended, Lyra observed gently. Otherwise, he never would have accepted my presence so readily. Cale's eyes met hers, something raw and grateful flickering behind them. I tried to soften certain aspects of his care over the years, small kindnesses my father would have considered dangerous weaknesses. But I never dared question the fundamental structure of control and obedience my father built. Not until I watched you kneel beside him on that battlefield, offering comfort with no expectation of anything in return. You showed him something I did not know how to offer, something perhaps buried so deep within his memory of his lost family, that even he had forgotten it existed until you awakened it again. The weight of this revelation settled heavily between them, and Lyra found herself understanding, with new clarity, why her presence had caused such profound disruption within the careful order Cale's father had spent years establishing. She was not merely offering comfort to an injured creature. She was, in some small way, healing a wound far older and deeper than any physical injury sustained on the battlefield, a wound of loss and isolation that had shaped Ashka's entire existence since infancy. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said softly, reaching for Cale's hand across the small space between them. "I know it wasn't easy to share. I find myself trusting you with a great many things I never intended to share with anyone," Cale admitted, his voice carrying quiet wonder at his own vulnerability. "It is a strange sensation, after so many years of guarding every thought and feeling, as a matter of necessary survival within this court." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the rain continued falling outside, Ashka's steady breathing providing a calming rhythm beneath their quiet conversation. Eventually, Cale spoke again, his voice softer, more uncertain than she had heard from him before. "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, regardless of how difficult the answer might be to voice aloud." "Of course," Lyra said, though a flicker of nervous uncertainty settled in her chest at his serious tone. "If circumstances required you to leave, whether through the council's decision or some other unforeseen danger, what would happen to Ashka? Would his bond with you fade over time, or would he suffer as he once suffered before you arrived to comfort him?" The question caught Lyra off guard, forcing her to consider possibilities she had been carefully avoiding since Edmund's old text first revealed the depth of what a mercy bond truly meant. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "The old texts suggested such bonds do not fade easily, if at all. I fear leaving might cause him more harm than the isolation he endured before we ever met." Cale's expression grew troubled, his grip tightening slightly around her hand. "Then we must ensure such circumstances never come to pass," he said with quiet determination. "Whatever conspiracy currently threatens your place here, whatever danger still lurks unidentified within this court, I will not allow it to succeed. Not for Ashka's sake alone, but for yours as well, Lyra. I have come to care for you far too deeply to imagine this palace, or my own life, without your presence within it." The declaration, spoken with such raw sincerity, brought unexpected tears to Lyra's eyes, the accumulated weight of weeks of fear, uncertainty, and growing affection, finally finding release in the quiet safety of the stable, surrounded by rain and lantern light and the steady, comforting presence of the beast who had first brought them together. "I care for you too," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and freeing in equal measure, "more than I ever expected to, given everything that stood between us when we first met." Cale leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, before pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, a tender gesture that carried far more weight than words alone could have expressed. Ashka let out a soft, contented sigh beside them, as though the great creature understood, in his own way, the significance of the moment unfolding beside his resting form. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the palace, far removed from the tender warmth of the stable, a far more sinister gathering was taking shape within Lord Edric's private chambers. Several figures cloaked in dark traveling attire moved silently through the shadows of the eastern corridor, slipping into the room one by one, until 6 individuals had gathered around a small table, lit only by a single, guttering candle. "Everything is arranged for Founding Day," Edric said quietly, addressing the assembled group with the calm authority of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of careful manipulation. "The beast handler I have secured will ensure Ashka is exposed to a particular substance during the celebration, one designed to strip away whatever unnatural calm the healer's girl has managed to instill within him. Once exposed, his true feral nature will reassert itself entirely, regardless of her presence or influence. And if the beast simply attacks her, instead of causing the wider chaos you require?" one of the cloaked figures asked, doubt evident in his rough voice. "Then she suffers the consequences of her own unnatural meddling," Edric replied coldly. "Either outcome serves our purpose. If he attacks her, the court witnesses firsthand the true danger of her supposed bond, proof that even her influence cannot overcome his fundamental nature, when properly provoked. If he attacks elsewhere, causing chaos among the gathered nobility, the king will have no choice but to acknowledge that such a creature, and by extension, the one who claims unique control over him, represents an unacceptable risk to this kingdom's safety." Lady Beatrice, seated near the edge of the gathering, shifted uncomfortably at the casual cruelty embedded within Edric's plan. "You speak of this so easily, as though the potential harm to an innocent girl means nothing at all." "Innocent girls do not disrupt centuries of established order without consequence, my lady," Edric replied sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin at her continued hesitation. "I would remind you that your own ambitions for your daughter's future depend entirely on this plan succeeding. Perhaps you should consider more carefully which outcome truly serves your interests, before questioning the necessary methods required to achieve them." Beatrice fell silent, though her expression remained troubled, a flicker of genuine conscience warring visibly against her long-cultivated ambition for her family's advancement within the court's rigid hierarchy. The other conspirators exchanged uneasy glances, though none dared voice further objection against Edric's clearly unwavering resolve. "The substance will be administered through his evening meal, 3 days before the celebration begins," Edric continued, unfazed by the tension rippling through his assembled allies. "Its effects are subtle at first, growing more pronounced as the days progress, ensuring that by the time Founding Day arrives, his behavior will be unpredictable enough to guarantee the outcome we require, regardless of the healer's continued presence or influence." As the meeting concluded and the conspirators slipped away into the rain-soaked darkness of the palace corridors, none of them noticed a young stable hand pausing near the corridor's edge, having wandered close enough to catch fragments of the conversation while running a late errand for the kitchen staff. The boy's eyes widened with fear and confusion as he processed what little he had overheard, uncertain what to do with knowledge that felt far too dangerous for someone of his humble station to possess. The stable boy, whose name was Wendell, spent that entire night unable to sleep, tossing restlessly upon his thin cot in the servant quarters while turning the overheard conversation over and over in his mind. He was only 14, an orphan taken in by the palace kitchens 2 years earlier, and the idea of confronting anyone about matters involving a Lord of Edric's standing filled him with a fear that settled deep into his stomach like a stone. He thought of simply forgetting what he had heard, of continuing his quiet, unremarkable duties without risking the wrath of a powerful noble who could crush someone of his station without a second thought. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Lyra kneeling beside Ashka on the day of her arrival, the gentle way she had spoken to the great beast when everyone else had fled in terror, the small kindness she had shown him personally, just weeks earlier, when she noticed him struggling to carry water buckets too heavy for his slight frame, offering to help without a hint of the condescension he usually received from those above his station. By morning, exhaustion and conscience had won out over fear, and Wendell found himself lingering near the kitchen entrance, watching for Clara, whom he knew spent considerable time near the stables, and might know how best to pass along what he had overheard, without drawing dangerous attention to himself. "You look like you haven't slept at all," Clara observed when she finally noticed him hovering nervously near the flour barrels, his hands twisting anxiously in his apron. "I need to tell someone something," Wendell said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else stood within earshot. "But I don't know who I can trust with it, and I'm frightened of what might happen if the wrong person finds out I know." Clara's expression sharpened with concern, recognizing the genuine fear in the boy's young voice. "You can trust me," she said gently, drawing him toward a quieter corner of the kitchen storeroom. "Whatever it is, Wendell, I promise I will help you figure out what to do." In halting, nervous words, Wendell recounted what he had overheard the previous night, the mention of a substance to be given to Ashka, the plan involving Founding Day, the cold calculation in Lord Edric's voice, as he described potential harm coming to Lyra without apparent concern. Clara's face grew increasingly pale as the details emerged, her earlier calm replaced by mounting alarm. "You did the right thing telling me," she said firmly once he finished, though her mind was already racing through the implications of what she had just learned. "I need you to stay quiet about this to everyone else. Do you understand? Not a word to anyone, until I figure out the safest way to bring this to someone who can actually act on it." Wendell nodded, visible relief washing over his young features, now that the burden of secrecy had been shared with someone he trusted. Clara sent him back to his duties with a reassuring pat on the shoulder, before hurrying toward the stables herself, her thoughts consumed by the urgent need to warn Lyra, before whatever plan Edric had set into motion could progress any further toward its cruel conclusion. Meanwhile, back within the quiet warmth of the stable the previous evening, Lyra and Cale's conversation had continued, long after the tender kiss pressed against her forehead, both of them reluctant to end the fragile intimacy that had finally blossomed between them after weeks of careful distance and unspoken feeling. "I have never told anyone the full truth about Ashka's past before tonight," Cale admitted, his fingers absently tracing patterns against the back of her hand as they sat together in the lantern light. "Not even my closest advisors know the full extent of what my father did to shape him into what the kingdom required. I suppose I was ashamed, in some strange way, of the cruelty required to create something the kingdom now depends upon so completely." "You were a child when it happened," Lyra said gently. "None of that cruelty belongs to you, Cale. You've spent years trying to soften what your father built, even if you didn't fully understand how to complete that healing until I arrived." "Perhaps," Cale said, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. "I sometimes wonder whether I inherited more of my father's coldness than I would like to admit, despite my efforts to be different from him in the ways that matter most." Lyra turned to face him fully, reaching up to gently cup his face in her hands, an intimacy that surprised them both with its natural ease. "I have watched you these past weeks, Cale. I have seen how you defended me before a hostile council, how you sat beside me through a terrifying night after the attack, how gently you speak of your mother's memory, even now. Whatever coldness your father instilled in you, it has not consumed the good that clearly still exists in your heart." Something shifted in Cale's expression at her words, a vulnerability breaking through his carefully maintained composure that few in the kingdom had ever been permitted to witness. "How did someone like you come into my life?" he murmured, more to himself than truly seeking an answer. "When I had convinced myself that such gentleness belonged only in old stories, not in the harsh realities of ruling a kingdom built on strength and careful calculation." "Maybe some things find their way to us exactly when we need them most," Lyra offered softly, "even if we never thought to ask for them." They remained together until the rain finally softened into a gentle mist, the lantern burning low as the hours slipped quietly past. Neither of them yet aware of the storm of an entirely different nature already gathering just beyond the palace walls, set into motion by ambitions far colder than anything the natural weather could produce, and neither yet aware that a frightened kitchen girl was already racing through the corridors toward the stables, carrying a warning that might still arrive in time to change everything that followed. Clara arrived at the stables breathless, her cheeks flushed from running, catching Lyra just as she was preparing to extinguish the lantern for the night. "I need to tell you something important," Clara gasped, glancing nervously over her shoulder, as though fearing she had been followed through the palace corridors. "It's about Founding Day, about Ashka." Cale, still present despite the late hour, rose immediately from his seat beside Lyra, his earlier warmth replaced instantly by sharp, focused attention. "What did you hear?" he asked, his voice carrying the commanding authority that had briefly softened during his private conversation with Lyra. Clara recounted everything Wendell had shared with her, the mention of a substance to be administered through Ashka's meals, the plan to expose his supposed instability before the gathered nobility during the upcoming celebration, the cold calculation evident in Lord Edric's voice as he described the potential consequences to Lyra herself. By the time she finished, Cale's expression had hardened into something dangerously close to fury, though he maintained careful control over his outward composure. "You are certain the boy heard Edric's name specifically?" Cale pressed, needing absolute clarity before taking any action against a member of his own council. "He was certain, my lord," Clara confirmed. He recognized Lord Edric's voice clearly, and he mentioned Lady Beatrice was also present, though she seemed less certain about the plan than the others gathered. Cale's jaw tightened at this confirmation of suspicions he had harbored since the earlier attack, suspicions he had been unable to act upon without sufficient proof. Now, finally, he possessed something concrete enough to move forward, though the timing presented its own complications, given how carefully Edric had likely covered his tracks against direct accusation. "Thank you, Clara," Cale said, his voice softening slightly, despite the tension radiating through his frame. "You may have just saved both Ashka and Lyra from significant harm. Please ensure Wendell understands he will face no consequences for coming forward, and that his courage tonight will not be forgotten." Clara nodded, relief evident on her face now that the burden of the dangerous secret had been properly shared with someone capable of acting upon it. She excused herself quickly, leaving Cale and Lyra alone once more amid the sudden, urgent weight of the revelation. "What will you do?" Lyra asked, fear tightening in her chest at the confirmation that the earlier attack had merely been a preview of far greater danger still to come. "I cannot simply arrest Edric based on second-hand testimony from a frightened stable boy," Cale said grimly, pacing the length of the stable as he considered the complicated political implications of the situation. "He would deny everything, and without concrete proof, such an accusation against a member of my own council would only fracture trust within this court further, potentially playing directly into whatever larger plan he has constructed." "Then what can we do?" Lyra pressed, watching Ashka shift restlessly nearby, as though sensing the tension building between them, despite not understanding the specific danger being discussed. Cale considered the problem carefully, his sharp mind already working through possible strategies. "We must be careful about how we proceed. If Edric realizes his plan has been discovered, he may simply adjust his methods rather than abandoning his intentions entirely. I believe our best course is to appear unaware, while quietly implementing protections that will prevent his plan from succeeding when Founding Day arrives." "What kind of protections?" Lyra asked. "I will personally oversee Ashka's meals from this point forward, ensuring nothing tainted reaches him without my direct knowledge. I will also increase the guard around both of you, significantly, though carefully enough to avoid drawing obvious suspicion from Edric or his allies." Cale's expression grew more determined as he spoke, the earlier tenderness between them now channeled into fierce protective resolve. "And I will begin quietly gathering additional evidence, perhaps enough to force a confession or catch him in the act, before Founding Day gives him the public stage he apparently desires for whatever cruel demonstration he intends." The following days passed with a tense, careful watchfulness settling over the palace, invisible to most observers but keenly felt by those aware of the danger quietly building beneath the surface of everyday court life. Cale personally inspected Ashka's meals each day, a task that raised occasional curious glances from kitchen staff, but drew no direct suspicion, given his well-known attachment to the beast. Additional guards were stationed near the stables under the pretense of increased security, following the earlier attack, their true purpose known only to a small, trusted circle that included Cale, Lyra, Nathaniel, and Clara. Nathaniel, once informed of the situation, proved instrumental in the quiet investigation that followed, using his decades of court experience to carefully trace financial records and old grudges that might reveal further evidence of Edric's involvement in both the earlier attack and the current, more elaborate scheme. "I have found troubling connections," Nathaniel reported, during a private meeting held in his book-lined chamber, several days before the Founding Day celebration was set to begin. A payment made through an intermediary trading company, one Edric has used previously for less scrupulous business arrangements, matches the timing of Oswin's earlier bribery almost exactly. It is not conclusive proof suitable for a formal trial, but combined with the stable boy's testimony, it paints a picture difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Will it be enough to stop him before Founding Day? Lyra asked, the celebration now looming only 3 days away, each passing hour heightening the tension that had settled over her like a physical weight. Perhaps not enough to convict him outright, Nathaniel admitted, but potentially enough to justify heightened precautions, and perhaps enough to confront him privately, forcing his hand before he can execute whatever plan he has arranged for the public celebration. Cale considered this option carefully, weighing the risks of confronting Edric directly against the danger of allowing his scheme to potentially unfold as originally planned, even with the additional protections already quietly implemented. A private confrontation carries its own risks, he said finally. If Edric realizes we know of his plan without possessing sufficient proof for formal punishment, he may simply retreat and wait for a future opportunity, one we may not be fortunate enough to discover in advance next time. Then perhaps the wisest course, Nathaniel suggested carefully, is to allow Founding Day to proceed largely as expected, while ensuring every possible protection remains in place. If Edric believes his plan remains undiscovered, he may reveal himself more completely in his attempt to execute it, providing the undeniable proof required to end his ambitions permanently, before witnesses too numerous to dismiss or intimidate into silence. The suggestion carried obvious danger, requiring Lyra and Ashka to essentially serve as bait for a trap designed to expose Edric's treachery before the full assembled court. Lyra felt her stomach tighten at the implications, though she understood the strategic logic behind Nathaniel's careful reasoning. I'm willing to face that risk, she said quietly, if it means finally ending this threat once and for all, rather than living under constant fear of the next attempt. Cale's expression carried visible reluctance, his protective instincts clearly warring against the practical necessity of the plan being proposed. I do not like placing you in deliberate danger, he said, his voice tight with concern. Whatever happens during that celebration, I will not allow you to face it without absolute certainty that every possible protection has been put firmly in place. I trust you, Lyra said simply, reaching for his hand with a confidence that surprised even herself, given the mounting danger they now faced together. And I trust Ashka. Whatever Edric has planned, I do not believe our bond is something so easily broken by whatever substance he intends to use against him. Ashka, as though sensing the gravity of the conversation unfolding around him, rose from his resting position and moved to press his massive head firmly against Lyra's side, a gesture of solidarity that seemed to carry more understanding than the great beast typically received credit for possessing. Cale watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and lingering worry, finally nodding in reluctant agreement to the dangerous plan taking shape before them. On the evening following the private meeting in Nathaniel's chamber, Cale arranged a quiet reward for Wendell, presenting the young stable boy with a small purse of coin and a formal position assisting the royal stable master, a promotion that would ensure both his continued safety and a measure of security he had never known during his difficult years as an orphan within the palace kitchens. You showed remarkable courage, Cale told him personally, kneeling slightly to meet the boy's eyes despite the difference in their stations. Many grown men in this court would not have found the bravery to speak up against someone as powerful as Lord Edric. Your honesty may well have saved lives. Wendell flushed with pride and lingering nervousness, glancing toward Lyra, who offered him a warm, grateful smile from where she stood beside Ashka. I just didn't want anything bad to happen to her, he admitted quietly. She's always been kind to me, even when she didn't have to be. Kindness has a way of returning to those who offer it freely, Lyra said, crossing the stable yard to properly thank him herself. Thank you, Wendell. Truly. The boy's promotion was announced quietly enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from Edric or his allies, framed simply as recognition for diligent service, rather than any indication of the deeper conspiracy quietly unfolding beneath the palace's polished surface. Meanwhile, within her own private chambers, Lady Beatrice found herself increasingly troubled by the direction Edric's plan had taken. Her earlier ambition now tangled uncomfortably with a conscience she had spent years trying to suppress in service of her daughter's future prospects. She paced restlessly before her window, watching the distant stable lights flicker in the evening darkness, torn between loyalty to the scheme she had helped set into motion and a growing unease about the potential harm awaiting an innocent young woman who had done nothing more than show kindness to a suffering creature. Her daughter Charlotte found her in this troubled state, her mother's uncharacteristic distraction drawing immediate concern. "Mother, is something wrong? You've barely touched your evening meal." "It's nothing, dear," Beatrice said, forcing a reassuring smile that did not quite reach her worried eyes. "Simply matters of the court weighing on my mind." Charlotte studied her mother carefully, an intelligence in her gaze that belied her young age. "This is about the healer's girl, isn't it? I've heard the whispers, Mother, about Lord Edric's plans for Founding Day. I confess, I do not fully understand why we must involve ourselves in something that risks such genuine harm to another person, simply to secure my own future prospects with the king." Beatrice's expression shifted with surprise at her daughter's perceptiveness, followed quickly by a flicker of shame she had not expected to feel so keenly. "I only wanted to secure a good future for you," she said softly. "A future befitting our family's standing within this kingdom." "I would rather build my own future through honest means," Charlotte said gently, "than see anyone suffer for the sake of ambitions I never fully asked for myself. Please, Mother, consider carefully what you are truly willing to risk in pursuit of this plan." Her daughter's words lingered heavily in Beatrice's mind long after Charlotte retired for the evening, planting seeds of doubt that would grow more insistent as Founding Day drew ever closer, though whether that doubt would translate into meaningful action against Edric's carefully constructed scheme remained uncertain, even to Beatrice herself. Back within the quiet stable, Lyra and Chaol spent their remaining evenings before the celebration in careful preparation, reviewing every possible precaution, while also allowing themselves small moments of stolen tenderness amid the mounting tension. Chaol taught her simple techniques for recognizing signs of distress in Ashka's behavior that might indicate the substance Edric intended to use had somehow been administered despite their precautions, while Lyra, in turn, shared additional herbal remedies she had learned from Agnes that might help counteract certain common poisons should the need arise. "I wish there was a way to avoid this entirely," Chaol admitted during one such evening, watching her carefully measure out dried herbs into small paper packets she intended to carry hidden within her dress during the celebration. "A way to simply arrest Edric now, before any of this becomes necessary." "I know," Lyra said gently, setting aside her work to take his hand, "but Nathaniel is right. Without proof strong enough to withstand challenge, any action now would only delay the inevitable confrontation, perhaps giving Edric time to construct an even more dangerous plan we might not discover in advance next time. Better to face this now, prepared and protected, than to live under constant uncertainty about when and how he might try again." Chaol nodded reluctantly, though the worry etched into his features did not fully fade. "Whatever happens during that celebration," he said quietly, "know that I will be watching over you every moment, ready to act the instant anything threatens your safety." "I know," Lyra said softly, leaning against his shoulder as Ashka settled contentedly beside them both. "Together, we'll face whatever comes." 3 days remained before Founding Day would arrive, bringing with it the culmination of weeks of careful scheming, quiet investigation, and growing love that had blossomed against every expectation amid the shadow of political conspiracy. Whatever happened when the celebration finally began, Lyra understood with growing certainty that the outcome would determine not only her own fate within the palace, but the future of the fragile, precious bond she shared with a creature the world had once believed incapable of trust, and the uncertain, hopeful future she had begun to imagine, alongside a king who had shown her more genuine warmth in a few short weeks than she had known throughout most of her difficult life before that fateful night beside the battlefield. Founding Day arrived beneath a bright, cloudless sky, the entire capital of Veremore alive with celebration, as nobles, merchants, and common folk alike gathered within and around the palace grounds to honor the kingdom's founding centuries earlier. Lyra stood near the edge of the grand courtyard where the central ceremonies would soon take place, her heart pounding steadily beneath the deceptively calm exterior she had worked hard to maintain throughout the morning's preparations. Ashka stood beside her, freshly groomed for the occasion, his amber eyes alert and watchful despite the festive atmosphere surrounding them both. She had checked him carefully that morning, along with Chaol, both of them searching for any sign that Edric's plan had already been set into motion despite their careful precautions. He seemed perfectly fine, calm and steady, and for a brief, hopeful moment, Lyra allowed herself to believe that perhaps their vigilance had successfully prevented whatever scheme Edric had originally intended. That hope shattered within the hour. The ceremonies began smoothly enough, with Chaol addressing the assembled crowd from a raised platform, speaking of the kingdom's history and the sacrifices made by those who had built Vermore into the strong, unified nation it had become. Lyra watched from her designated position near the platform's edge, Ashka resting calmly beside her, until she noticed a subtle shift in his behavior that sent immediate alarm racing through her chest. His ears flattened slightly against his skull. A low, barely audible whine escaped his throat, and his massive body began to tremble faintly, almost imperceptibly at first, growing more pronounced with each passing minute. "Chaol," she called softly, though the king remained occupied addressing the crowd, unable to immediately notice the subtle distress building in his beast. Lyra knelt beside Ashka, running her hands carefully along his sides, searching for any obvious sign of injury or distress that might explain his sudden change in demeanor. His eyes, when they met hers, carried a wildness she had not seen since the very first night she found him wounded on the battlefield, an unfocused quality that suggested something was indeed affecting him from within, exactly as Edric had planned. "No," she whispered, dread pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. "Not now. Not here." The trembling intensified rapidly, Ashka's low whine transforming into something closer to a growl, drawing curious and increasingly alarmed glances from nearby members of the crowd. Lyra tried desperately to calm him, using every technique she had learned over the past weeks, speaking softly, maintaining gentle contact, but nothing seemed to penetrate the confusion and pain clearly building within him. "Something is wrong with the beast," someone in the crowd shouted, panic beginning to ripple outward, as more people noticed Ashka's increasingly erratic behavior. Chaol's speech faltered as he finally registered the commotion, his eyes finding Lyra's frightened face across the courtyard, understanding immediately what was happening. "Clear the courtyard," Chaol commanded, his voice carrying easily over the growing murmur of alarmed spectators, guards immediately moving to usher nervous nobles and common folk toward the safety of the surrounding buildings. "Lyra, get back from him. Now." But Lyra could not bring herself to abandon Ashka, not when she could see the confusion and fear evident behind his wild, unfocused eyes, a creature trapped within his own suddenly uncontrollable instincts through no fault of his own. "I won't leave him," she called back, even as the great beast's trembling grew violent enough to nearly knock her from her feet when she pressed close against his side. Lord Edric watched the unfolding chaos from a carefully chosen vantage point near the edge of the courtyard, a thin, satisfied smile playing at the corner of his mouth, despite the panic spreading rapidly through the gathered crowd. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned, and within moments, he expected the beast's uncontrolled fury to provide all the proof necessary to end the healer girl's dangerous influence permanently, one way or another. Ashka's growl deepened into something far more menacing, his massive form coiling with barely contained violence, as the substance coursing through his system continued stripping away his careful training and hard-won trust in favor of raw, primal instinct. Lyra remained pressed against his side despite the obvious danger, her voice growing increasingly desperate as she tried to reach whatever remained of the gentle creature she had come to know beneath the mounting chaos of his affliction. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, as she cupped his massive jaw in her trembling hands, forcing him to meet her gaze despite his obvious distress. "I know you're still in there. Please, Ashka. Come back to me." For a terrifying moment, his eyes remained wild and unfocused, his growl deepening further, as his muscles coiled with barely restrained violence that threatened to erupt at any moment. Guards moved cautiously closer, weapons drawn despite Chaol's earlier orders forbidding harm to the beast, torn between protecting the panicked crowd and following commands that suddenly seemed impossibly dangerous, given the creature's obvious instability. "Stand down," Chaol roared, pushing through the gathering guards to reach Lyra's side despite the obvious risk to his own safety. "No one harms him. Do you understand me? No one." A young guard, newer to his post and unfamiliar with the careful instructions Chaol had issued earlier that morning, raised his spear instinctively as Ashka's growl deepened into something closer to a roar, his training urging him to protect the crowd, regardless of the king's earlier command against harming the beast. His hand trembled visibly around the weapon's shaft, torn between duty and obvious terror, as he inched closer to where Lyra remained pressed against Ashka's shuddering side. "Put that down," Kale snapped, spotting the guard's movement from the corner of his eye, even as he continued making his way through the panicked crowd. "That is a direct order." The young guard hesitated, his eyes darting between his king's furious command and the terrifying sight of the massive beast, trembling with barely contained violence, only steps away from an unprotected young woman. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though fear might override obedience entirely, the spear's tip inching forward, despite Kale's command. "Lower your weapon," Nathaniel's voice cut through the chaos with unexpected sharpness, the elderly chancellor moving with surprising speed to place himself firmly between the guard and Lyra's position. "The king has given you a command. I suggest you remember, your duty extends to obedience, not merely instinct." The guard finally lowered his spear, shame and lingering fear evident on his young face, as he stepped back into the crowd of similarly uncertain soldiers, all of them watching the unfolding crisis with a mixture of horror and helpless confusion about how to properly respond to a situation none of their training had adequately prepared them to handle. Nathaniel, who had been observing the crowd carefully throughout the ceremony, precisely because of his suspicions, spotted Edric's satisfied expression from across the chaos, and immediately understood the full scope of what was unfolding. He signaled quietly to a group of trusted guards positioned specifically for this possibility, guards who began moving carefully toward Edric's position, even as the greater crisis with Ashka continued unfolding at the courtyard's center. Lyra, ignoring the mounting danger around her, continued speaking softly to Ashka, her voice cutting through the chaos with a gentle persistence that refused to give up, despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. "Remember the battlefield," she whispered urgently. "Remember when I first found you, when you let me help, even though you didn't have to trust anyone. Remember the nights in the stable, the mornings in the garden. That's real, Ashka. This feeling right now, this wildness, it isn't you. Fight it. Please, fight it and come back to me." Something shifted in the depths of his wild, unfocused eyes, a flicker of recognition breaking through the chemical confusion clouding his mind. His trembling did not fully cease, but the coiled violence in his massive frame eased slightly, enough that Lyra dared to press her forehead gently against his own, maintaining the intimate contact despite the obvious risk. Kale reached her side in that same moment, kneeling carefully beside them both, his own voice joining hers, in soft, steady reassurance. "You are stronger than whatever they have done to you," he said firmly, his hand resting gently against Ashka's trembling shoulder. "You have fought through worse than this before. Fight through this too, old friend." The combined presence of both Lyra and Kale seemed to anchor something within the struggling beast, his wild growling slowly transforming back into something closer to a distressed whine, his massive body sagging with obvious exhaustion as whatever battle raged within his mind gradually began tilting back toward the trust and calm he had built over the preceding weeks. It was in this critical moment, with Ashka still trembling and vulnerable between recovery and relapse, that Lord Edric made his final, desperate move, unwilling to watch his carefully constructed plan collapse without one final attempt to secure the outcome he desired. "The beast remains dangerous," he shouted, pushing forward through the crowd toward the platform where several council members still watched the unfolding crisis with visible alarm. "This proves exactly what I have warned this council about for weeks. That creature cannot be trusted, regardless of whatever unnatural influence this girl claims to hold over him. He must be put down immediately, before he causes genuine tragedy among the gathered crowd." His words found sympathetic ears among several frightened nobles, murmurs of agreement rippling through sections of the crowd still recovering from the terror of Ashka's earlier violent display. A few guards, uncertain of proper protocol amid such unprecedented chaos, began moving forward with weapons raised, torn between conflicting commands and the obvious, immediate danger the beast's earlier behavior had represented. "Stop." Lyra's voice rang out with unexpected strength, rising above the mounting chaos as she positioned herself directly between the advancing guards and Ashka's still recovering form. "He is not dangerous. He was poisoned, deliberately, by someone within this very court who wished to see him destroyed for their own ambitious purposes." Her accusation, spoken with clear, unwavering conviction, brought a sudden, startled silence over significant portions of the crowd, all eyes turning toward Edric, whose confident expression flickered momentarily with something close to genuine alarm. "A serious accusation," Nathaniel said, stepping forward with the full weight of his authority as Chancellor, his guards now flanking Edric's position, with quiet, but unmistakable purpose. "One that happens to align rather precisely with evidence my own investigation has uncovered over the past several days, Lord Edric. Evidence involving payments made to a laborer named Oswin, and a substance capable of producing exactly the symptoms we have all just witnessed." The color drained rapidly from Edric's face as he realized, with dawning horror, that his carefully constructed plan had been anticipated and countered long before Founding Day had even begun. "This is absurd," he protested, though his voice carried far less conviction than his earlier confident accusations. "I have done nothing but express legitimate concerns for this kingdom's safety." "Legitimate concerns rarely require secret midnight meetings and hired poisoners," Kale said coldly, rising from beside Ashka to face his cousin directly, his expression carrying a fury Lyra had not yet witnessed from him, despite their weeks of growing intimacy. "You have endangered innocent lives, both human and otherwise, purely to satisfy your own ambitions within this court. That ends today, Edric." As guards moved to formally detain Lord Edric amid the stunned silence of the gathered crowd, a final, unexpected development unfolded that would forever alter the outcome of the day's dramatic confrontation. Ashka, having fully recovered his senses through the combined efforts of Lyra and Kale's steady presence, rose slowly to his feet, his earlier wildness completely vanished, replaced by calm, deliberate purpose. He moved directly toward Lyra, and before the astonished eyes of the entire assembled court, lowered his massive body into a deep, deliberate bow, his head touching the ground before her feet, in a gesture no one present had ever witnessed from any creature of his kind, let alone one raised specifically for the singular purpose of unwavering obedience to royal command alone. A profound silence settled over the courtyard, broken only by scattered gasps of astonishment from the gathered nobility and common folk alike. Even Nathaniel, who had witnessed countless strange and significant events throughout his decades of service within the palace, stared at the scene with undisguised wonder. "In all my years," he murmured softly, "I have never witnessed anything quite like this." Kale watched the display with an expression that mixed pride, wonder, and profound relief, understanding perhaps more clearly than anyone else present exactly what this unprecedented gesture truly represented. Ashka was not simply demonstrating recovered calm after a terrifying ordeal. He was offering, before the entire kingdom, undeniable proof of a bond deeper and more genuine than any training or command structure had ever managed to instill within him throughout his difficult, painful existence. Lyra, tears still tracking down her face from the earlier terror and desperate relief now mingling within her chest, knelt slowly to meet Ashka at his level, wrapping her arms around his massive neck despite the watching eyes of the entire court. "Thank you for fighting your way back to me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you could do it." Around them, the crowd remained transfixed by the extraordinary scene, whispers of wonder replacing the earlier panic and fear that had gripped the courtyard only minutes before. Whatever doubts had lingered about the nature of Lyra's bond with the kingdom's most feared creature had been utterly dispelled by this single, undeniable act of devotion, witnessed by hundreds of eyes that would carry the story far beyond the palace walls in the days and weeks to come. Guards led a pale, defeated Edric away toward the palace's holding cells, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the public exposure of his treacherous scheme. Lady Beatrice, watching from a distance with her daughter Charlotte's hand held tightly in her own, felt a complicated mixture of relief and shame settle over her, grateful that her own hesitation had prevented her from further involvement in whatever fate now awaited her former co-conspirator, while acknowledging privately the moral cowardice that had allowed her to participate as long as she had before conscience finally intervened. As the immediate chaos of the day's dramatic events began settling into something closer to stunned calm, Kale moved to stand beside Lyra and Ashka, his hand finding hers amid the lingering crowd of witnesses, no longer concerned with maintaining careful distance or hidden affection, given everything that had just been revealed before the entire kingdom's assembled nobility and common folk alike. "It's over," he said softly, though the weight of everything still requiring resolution remained evident in his tired but relieved expression. Whatever comes next, Edric's treachery has been exposed, and Ashka's true nature has been witnessed by more people than I ever imagined possible. What happens now? Lyra asked, still processing the overwhelming events of the past hour. Ashka resting calmly against her side once more. His earlier wildness completely faded into peaceful, exhausted contentment. Kale's eyes met hers with quiet, unwavering certainty, and for the first time since their extraordinary journey together had begun weeks earlier on a distant, war-torn battlefield, he allowed himself to speak plainly of a future he had not previously dared to imagine aloud, before the watching eyes of his entire court. In the hours that followed, as physicians and guards worked to restore order throughout the palace grounds, Lyra remained close to Ashka's side, within the quiet sanctuary of the stables, monitoring his recovery carefully, despite Kale's insistence that she rest and allow others to assist. The great beast's trembling had fully subsided by early evening, his amber eyes clear and alert once more, though he remained unusually subdued, as though the ordeal had left a lingering weariness that even his remarkable resilience could not immediately shake off. "You did something extraordinary today," Kale told her quietly, having finally returned from the exhausting process of addressing the shaken council and beginning formal proceedings against Edric's confirmed treachery, not just in calming him, but in refusing to abandon him, even when every instinct and every voice around you urged you toward safety instead. "I couldn't leave him," Lyra said simply, resting her head against Ashka's steady, warm side. "Not when I knew, somewhere beneath all that confusion, he was still the same creature who trusted me enough to let me clean his wounds on that battlefield weeks ago." Nathaniel arrived shortly after, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the afternoon untangling a conspiracy, years in the making. "Edric has confessed to everything," he reported, settling wearily onto the low bench near the stable entrance. Faced with the combined weight of Oswin's testimony, the financial records, and the undeniable evidence of today's events, witnessed by half the kingdom's nobility, he saw little value in continuing his denials. He will face formal judgment before the full council within the week, though I suspect exile is the most merciful outcome he can now hope for, given the severity of his actions. "And Lady Beatrice?" Lyra asked, remembering the conflicted expression she had glimpsed on the noblewoman's face during the earlier chaos. "She has come forward voluntarily with additional information," Nathaniel said, a note of grudging respect entering his tired voice. "Her testimony, along with evidence that she attempted to distance herself from the plan's more dangerous elements in its final days, will likely earn her a lighter judgment than Edric's, though she will certainly face consequences for her initial involvement. Her daughter Charlotte, it seems, played no small part in encouraging that late change of heart." Lyra found herself feeling an unexpected measure of compassion for Beatrice, despite everything the noblewoman's ambitions had nearly cost her, understanding perhaps better than most within the palace how fear and desperation could drive people toward choices they might not otherwise have considered under calmer circumstances. As evening settled fully over the palace grounds, the earlier chaos of Founding Day gradually giving way to quiet, exhausted relief throughout the kingdom's capital, Kale remained beside Lyra and Ashka, within the peaceful sanctuary of the stable. The three of them finally allowed a moment of genuine calm, after weeks of mounting danger and uncertainty. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, still processing the overwhelming events of the past hour. Ashka resting calmly against her side once more, his earlier wildness completely faded into peaceful, exhausted contentment. Kale's eyes met hers with quiet, unwavering certainty, and for the first time since their extraordinary journey together had begun weeks earlier on a distant, war-torn battlefield, he allowed himself to speak plainly of a future he had not previously dared to imagine aloud, before the watching eyes of his entire court. "Now," he said softly, "we begin building whatever comes next, together." 3 weeks after Founding Day, the formal council chamber, that had once viewed Lyra with such open suspicion, now gathered for an entirely different purpose. The air within the grand room, carrying none of the earlier hostility that had once made her feel so unwelcome within its imposing walls. Lord Edric had been formally exiled from Vermore's borders following his complete confession, stripped of his titles and lands, sent away under armed escort to live out his remaining years, far from the court he had once schemed so desperately to control. Lady Beatrice, having provided crucial testimony against him, and demonstrated genuine remorse for her own involvement, retained her position within the court, though under considerably more careful watch, her ambitions for her daughter's future now channeled toward more honest pursuits, encouraged in no small part by Charlotte's own quiet insistence. Chaol stood before the assembled council, Lyra beside him, Ashka resting calmly at their feet in a position that had become entirely familiar to everyone within the palace over the preceding weeks. The great beast's presence no longer inspired the fear and suspicion it once had, replaced instead by a kind of respectful wonder that had settled over the entire kingdom following the public revelation of his extraordinary bond with the healer who had first shown him genuine kindness. This council has spent generations operating under certain assumptions about strength, control, and the proper order required to maintain a stable kingdom, Chaol began, his voice carrying easily across the chamber that had witnessed so much of the drama that had unfolded over recent months. Recent events have taught me, and I believe many of you as well, that perhaps some of those assumptions deserved far more scrutiny than they previously received. He turned to look at Lyra, warmth evident in his expression despite the formal setting surrounding them both. Loyalty forged through fear and rigid control proved far less resilient than loyalty built through genuine compassion and trust. Ashka's recovery during the crisis of Founding Day, his willingness to fight through whatever poison had been forced upon him, specifically to return to the person who had shown him kindness, taught this entire court something valuable about the true nature of strength. Nathaniel, seated near the front of the gathered council, nodded approvingly, his earlier suspicion toward Lyra long since transformed into genuine respect and even fondness for the young woman who had weathered so many challenges with remarkable grace and determination. It is for this reason, Chaol continued, his voice growing more personal despite the formal setting, that I stand before you today, not only to formally close the matter of Lord Edric's treachery, but to announce a decision of far greater personal significance. A hush fell over the chamber, as Chaol turned fully to face Lyra, taking her hands gently in his own, before the watching eyes of the entire assembled council, a gesture that required no further explanation for anyone present who had witnessed the growing bond between them over the preceding months. Lyra came into this kingdom as a healer's assistant, asking for nothing beyond the opportunity to ease suffering wherever she found it, Chaol said, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable conviction. She has since become someone I cannot imagine, building this kingdom's future without, both for the extraordinary gift she has shown in healing bonds, thought impossible to form, and for the person she has become to me personally, someone whose courage and compassion have reshaped my own understanding of what true strength requires. He knelt then, before the entire council, before Ashka's watchful amber eyes, before the weight of tradition and expectation that had once seemed so immovable within these very walls, and asked a question that required no further words to convey its significance to everyone present. Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the culmination of everything they had faced together since that chaotic night on the battlefield weeks earlier, when she had known nothing more than the simple, unshakable instinct that a wounded creature deserved comfort, regardless of the danger it seemed to represent. "Yes," she said softly, her voice carrying easily through the hushed silence of the grand chamber. "Yes, I will." The council erupted into applause and murmured congratulations, even those who had once viewed her presence with the deepest suspicion, now recognizing the undeniable truth of what had grown between the king and the healer's girl, who had first knelt beside his wounded beast, without a moment's hesitation. Ashka rose to his feet amid the celebration, pressing his massive head affectionately against both of them in turn, a gesture that drew warm laughter from the gathered council, a stark contrast to the fear and suspicion his presence had once inspired within these same walls. Before the celebration could properly begin, however, one final matter required the council's formal attention, a matter Nathaniel raised with careful deliberation once the initial excitement of Chaol's announcement had settled. "There remains the question of Ashka's formal status," the elderly chancellor said, addressing the gathered council with his usual measured precision. "The old laws governing royal beasts were never designed to account for a bond, such as the one we have all witnessed. I propose this council formally recognize the creature's unique position, neither purely royal property nor simply a wild beast, but something new entirely, a companion bonded equally to both crown and healer, deserving of protections befitting that singular status. The proposal received unanimous support, a remarkable turnaround from the suspicion and fear that had once dominated every council discussion involving Lyra's presence within the palace. Chaol signed the formal decree himself, Ashka's massive paw pressed carefully into wax beside the king's own seal, an unprecedented gesture that would be remembered in the kingdom's records for generations to come, as the moment tradition finally bent to accommodate a truth too powerful to deny any longer. "It seems fitting," Chaol observed afterward, watching Ashka sniff curiously at the parchment bearing his own mark, "that he should have a voice, of sorts, in decisions concerning his own future, given everything he has endured and overcome throughout his life." "He's earned that much at least," Lyra agreed, scratching gently behind the great beast's ear, as he rumbled with evident contentment at the attention. In the months that followed, Lyra's transition, from healer's assistant to future queen of Veremore, proceeded with far less resistance than either she or Chaol had initially anticipated, the kingdom's people having already embraced her story with genuine affection, drawn by the remarkable tale of compassion, triumphing over fear, that had spread throughout every corner of the realm following Founding Day's dramatic events. Agnes traveled from the healing camps to attend the eventual wedding celebration, tears of pride and joy streaming down her weathered face as she watched the girl she had raised stand before the entire kingdom, transformed from a quiet, solitary orphan into someone capable of reshaping an entire court's understanding of strength and loyalty. "I always knew you were meant for something extraordinary," Agnes told her privately, during a quiet moment before the ceremony began, embracing Lyra warmly, despite the formal finery she now wore. "I simply never imagined it would look quite like this." "Neither did I," Lyra admitted, laughing softly through her own happy tears. "But I wouldn't change a single moment of how we got here." Clara and Margaret, both promoted to positions of greater responsibility within the royal household following their loyalty and assistance during the crisis, stood proudly among the wedding guests, while Wendell, now fully settled into his role assisting the royal stablemaster, beamed with quiet pride at having played his own small but crucial part in the story that had captured the entire kingdom's imagination. Ashka, adorned for the occasion with a simple garland of flowers woven carefully around his massive neck by Lyra's own hands, remained close throughout the ceremony, a living symbol of the extraordinary bond that had first brought Lyra and Chaol together and had ultimately reshaped an entire kingdom's understanding of what true loyalty could look like when built upon genuine kindness rather than fear alone. During the quiet feast that followed the formal ceremony, Charlotte approached Lyra with a shy but genuine smile, offering her congratulations amid the swirl of music and celebration filling the palace's grand hall.
"I am glad my mother chose honesty in the end," she said softly. "I believe she is genuinely happier now, freed from the weight of ambitions that were never truly her own to carry so heavily."
"I'm glad as well," Lyra said warmly, understanding better than most how difficult it could be to break free from patterns of fear and survival long enough to choose a gentler path forward. "Please tell her I hold no lasting resentment for what happened. We all make difficult choices when we believe we have no other options available to us." Charlotte's smile deepened with visible relief, and the two young women spent a pleasant while longer speaking together, an unexpected friendship beginning to take root amid the joyful chaos of the wedding celebration, one more small example of the healing that seemed to naturally follow wherever Lyra chose to extend her characteristic compassion. Later that evening, as the formal celebrations wound down and guests began departing toward their own quarters throughout the palace, Chaol found a quiet moment alone with Lyra beneath the stars scattered brightly across the clear night sky, Ashka resting peacefully nearby, as he so often did during their most treasured, private moments together. "Do you have any regrets?" Chaol asked softly, his arm wrapped comfortably around her shoulders, as they stood together overlooking the palace gardens, where their story had taken so many important turns over the preceding months. "Not a single one," Lyra answered without hesitation, leaning contentedly into his warmth. "Every difficult moment led us here, to this exact place, and I would not trade that journey for an easier path that might have led somewhere less true to who we've both become." Chaol pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, echoing the tender gesture from that rainy evening in the stable so many months earlier, when their feelings for one another had first found honest voice, amid the quiet comfort of Ashka's steady presence. "Neither would I," he murmured, "not for anything this world could offer." Years later, when travelers passed through Veremore and asked about the strange, wonderful story of the beast who had knelt before a healer's assistant, the people of the kingdom would tell it with genuine warmth and pride, a tale passed down through generations, as proof that even the most feared and misunderstood among them could find healing, trust, and belonging, provided someone was willing to offer compassion without expecting anything in return. And within the palace walls, long after the celebrations had faded into cherished memory, Lyra would often find herself in the quiet stables during peaceful evening hours, Ashka resting contentedly beside her, just as he had on that very first night, beside the battlefield. A reminder of how far they had both traveled together, and of the simple, powerful truth that had guided her through every challenge along the way. Kindness, freely given, had the power to change everything, even the fate of kingdoms, one gentle act at a time.